You've been taught to believe that being loved is worth any sacrifice, that if someone chooses you, stays with you, wants you, then the pain of changing yourself is just part of the price. But if that were true, why do so many people feel lost inside relationships? Why do so many people smile for others while quietly disappearing inside? Why does the search for love so often leave the heart more exhausted, more confused, more empty? The truth is, love was never meant to cost you your voice, your peace, your dignity, or your sense of self. And Buddhist wisdom reveals something deeper. Your worth does not begin when someone approves of you. It begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself for acceptance. For centuries, the deepest teachings of Buddhism have pointed to a freedom that does not depend on being chosen, chased, or constantly reassured. A freedom built on awareness, inner stillness, truth, and the courage to remain whole, even when love is uncertain. Tonight, as you listen to these lessons, something will begin to soften. The fear of not being enough will loosen. The pressure to perform will begin to fade, and the part of you that has been neglected for too long will start to return. You will feel a quiet strength rising where confusion used to live, and when you wake up tomorrow, you may begin to see love and yourself in a completely different way, calmer, clearer, and no longer willing to disappear just to be wanted. This is not just something to listen to before sleep. This is a return to the self you were never meant to lose. Are you ready? Let's begin. And now something shifts. Because understanding that love should not cost you your sense of self is one thing, but seeing where you have already paid that price without noticing is something else entirely. This is where the truth becomes uncomfortable, but also freeing. The moment you begin to look closely, you may start to recognize patterns, not in others first, but in yourself. The quiet ways you have tried to be chosen, the subtle ways you have walked away from your own truth just to keep someone close, the invisible deals you made without even realizing it. And this is where the real work begins, because before you can return to yourself, you have to see where you left. A quiet realization begins to surface. Something inside has been trying too hard for too long. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from work or stress or lack of sleep. It comes from constantly adjusting who you are just to remain wanted. It comes from watching your words before they leave your mouth, from rehearsing conversations in your head, from second-guessing your own feelings because someone else might not approve of them. And beneath all of that, there is a deeper truth that has been waiting patiently to be seen. The hunger to be chosen can feel like love, but often it is something much older, much deeper, and much more fragile. It is not just about wanting someone, it is about needing confirmation that you are worth staying for. This need rarely appears suddenly. It is shaped slowly, over time. It grows in the spaces where love once felt uncertain, where acceptance felt conditional, where being yourself did not always guarantee connection. And so the mind learns something powerful but dangerous. It learns that being loved may require becoming something else. At first, the changes are small. You hold back a thought here. You soften a boundary there. You become a little more agreeable, a little more flexible, a little less demanding of your own needs. It feels harmless. It even feels wise. But each small adjustment carries a hidden cost. Because every time you move away from your truth, even slightly, something inside you takes note. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. A subtle awareness begins to form, one that says, "This is not fully me." And yet you continue, because being chosen feels too important to risk. This is how self-betrayal begins, not as a single moment, but as a pattern, a series of small decisions that slowly reshape your identity around someone else's comfort. You become more attentive to their moods than your own. You begin to prioritize their approval over your clarity. You start measuring your value by how they respond to you, how they look at you, how they treat you on their best days and their worst. And without realizing it, your sense of self becomes unstable, because it is no longer anchored within you. It is floating, dependent on something outside your control. This is where suffering begins to deepen. Not because love is present, but because your relationship with yourself has been quietly neglected. Buddhist wisdom speaks clearly about this kind of suffering. It teaches that attachment, especially when rooted in fear, leads to a distortion of reality. You begin to see what you want to see, ignore what you should not ignore, and tolerate what you once knew was not right. The mind becomes skilled at justification. You tell yourself they are just having a bad day. You convince yourself that things will improve. You explain away moments that hurt you because losing them feels more frightening than losing yourself. But there is a limit to how long this can continue, because the self does not disappear completely. It waits, it watches, it feels the tension between who you are and who you are pretending to be, and eventually that tension becomes impossible to ignore. It may show up as anxiety that you cannot explain, a sense of restlessness that follows you even in quiet moments, a feeling that something is off, even when everything looks fine from the outside. This is not weakness. This is awareness trying to return. The deeper truth is this: being chosen by someone else means very little if the version of you they choose is not real, because what they are connected to is not your essence, but your adaptation. And adaptation, no matter how skillful, is not sustainable. At some point, the effort of maintaining it becomes heavier than the fear of losing them. And this is where a powerful question begins to form. What am I sacrificing to be loved like this? Not in a dramatic sense, but in the quiet details of your daily experience. Are you able to speak freely, or do you filter yourself constantly? Do you feel safe being fully honest, or do you calculate your words to avoid conflict? Are your needs expressed, or are they quietly suppressed in the hope that they will be noticed without asking? These questions are not meant to create guilt. They are meant to create clarity. Because clarity is the first step toward freedom. In Buddhist teaching, there is a deep understanding that clinging creates suffering. Not because connection is wrong, but because when connection is built on fear, it becomes fragile. The fear of not being chosen leads to behaviors that slowly disconnect you from yourself. And the more disconnected you become, the more you rely on the other person to fill that gap. This creates a cycle that is difficult to break. You give more to feel secure. You adjust more to avoid loss. You tolerate more to maintain stability. But stability built this way is not real. It is conditional. It depends on how well you continue to abandon yourself. And this is why it never feels peaceful. There is always a part of you that knows, a part that remembers what it felt like to be fully aligned, to speak without hesitation, to exist without needing constant validation. That part may feel distant now, but it is not gone. It is waiting for you to turn back toward it. This turning does not require dramatic action. It begins with honesty. Honesty about what you feel, even if you do not act on it immediately. Honesty about what you need, even if you are not ready to express it fully. Honesty about what you have been ignoring in order to keep the connection. This honesty is not meant to break anything, it is meant to restore something, because without it, you continue to build relationships on a version of yourself that cannot hold over time. And eventually, something will collapse. Either the connection or your inner stability, sometimes both. The deeper lesson here is not about rejecting love. It is about understanding that love cannot thrive where self-betrayal exists. Because real connection requires presence, and presence requires truth. Without truth, there is only performance. And performance, no matter how convincing, creates distance. Distance from yourself, distance from others, distance from what is real. The hunger to be chosen often hides a deeper longing, not just to be loved, but to feel safe, to feel seen, to feel accepted without needing to change. But that kind of acceptance cannot be forced, and it cannot be earned through self-rejection. It can only exist where authenticity is allowed. This is why Buddhist wisdom places so much importance on returning to one's own nature, not the version shaped by fear or expectation or past conditioning, but the deeper self that exists beneath all of that, the self that does not need to be improved to be worthy, the self that does not need to perform to be accepted, the self that simply is. Returning to this self is not always comfortable, because it requires letting go of strategies that once felt necessary. It requires facing the possibility that some connections may not survive your honesty. It requires trusting that losing what depends on your self-betrayal is not a real loss. And that trust does not come easily, but it grows slowly, with each moment of awareness, with each small act of alignment, with each decision to honor your truth, even when it feels uncertain. And over time, something begins to change. The need to be chosen loses its urgency, not because you no longer care about connection, but because your sense of worth is no longer dependent on it. You begin to experience a different kind of stability, one that is not shaken by someone else's inconsistency, one that does not collapse when attention fades, one that remains regardless of who stays or leaves. This stability is quiet. It does not demand recognition. It does not seek validation. It simply exists. And from this place, love becomes something entirely different. It is no longer a transaction. It is no longer a performance. It is no longer a test of your ability to adapt. It becomes a shared space where both people can exist without losing themselves. And if that space cannot be created, you no longer feel compelled to force it, because you understand something deeply. Being alone in your truth is less painful than being chosen in your absence. And that understanding changes everything. It changes how you see yourself. It changes how you relate to others. It changes what you are willing to accept and what you are no longer willing to tolerate. Not out of pride, not out of fear, but out of respect for the self that you have finally begun to reclaim. And that self, once returned to, does not ask for perfection. It asks for presence. It asks for honesty. It asks for the courage to remain, even when it would be easier to disappear. Because disappearing has never brought peace, only temporary relief, followed by deeper disconnection. But staying with yourself, even in uncertainty, even in discomfort, even in the face of potential loss, that is where real peace begins to grow. Not loud, not immediate, but steady and unshakable. And as this peace deepens, something else becomes clear. You were never meant to earn love by abandoning who you are. You were meant to experience love as an extension of your wholeness, not as a replacement for it. And anything that requires you to be less than whole to receive it is not something you were meant to keep. This is not a loss. This is a return to the self that existed before fear shaped your choices. A return to the truth that does not need approval to remain valid. A return to a kind of inner freedom that no one else can give you and no one else can take away. And from here, everything begins again. But this time, you are not searching to be chosen. You are living as someone who has already chosen themselves. And that changes the way the world meets you, quietly, naturally, without force. Because when you no longer abandon yourself, you stop attracting situations that require you to. And what remains is something far more real, something far more stable, something that no longer asks you to disappear just to belong. And this is where the next truth begins to reveal itself. Because once a person starts returning to themselves, they also begin to see something they once called love with very different eyes. They begin to notice that not everything intense is sacred. Not everything painful is deep. Not everything that keeps the heart restless is proof of a powerful connection. Sometimes what felt like love was actually fear wearing love's clothing. Sometimes what looked like devotion was really desperation. Sometimes what felt impossible to let go of was not a soul-deep bond, but an attachment so tight that it had started to feel like identity. And this is why the next lesson matters so deeply. Because if the hunger to be chosen teaches how self-betrayal begins, then this next truth reveals why so many people stay trapped inside emotional suffering and still call it love. Something tender is often hiding behind what looks like love. A person waits for a message and their whole body tightens. A voice changes and the mind begins racing. A small distance appears and suddenly the heart feels unsafe. The connection becomes the center of emotional weather. If the other person is warm, there is relief. If they are cold, there is panic. If they are present, there is peace for a moment. If they pull away, the whole inner world starts shaking. This feels powerful. It feels meaningful. It feels like the other person matters more than anyone else ever has. But that does not always mean it is love. Very often, it is attachment. Attachment is one of the most misunderstood emotional experiences in human life because it can feel almost identical to devotion in the beginning. It can look like loyalty, longing, passion, commitment, and depth. It can make people write poems, lose sleep, wait for years, ignore reality, and call all of it proof that the bond is special. But Buddhist wisdom asks a harder question. It does not ask only how strong the feeling is, it asks what is underneath it. Is there freedom in it or fear? Is there peace in it or constant grasping? Does it allow both people to exist fully, or does one person become emotionally chained to the presence, approval, or attention of the other? These questions matter because love and attachment do not grow from the same root, even if they sometimes share the same language. Love has space in it. Attachment has pressure. Love can care deeply and still breathe. Attachment suffocates easily. Love wants the good of the other person, even when the ego is not centered. Attachment wants relief from its own anxiety and often uses the other person as the source of that relief. That difference changes everything. A person caught in attachment often says, "I just love them so much." But if the truth were spoken more honestly, it might sound like this: "I do not know who I am when they are distant. I do not know how to feel steady when they are not reassuring me. I do not know how to sit with my own emptiness, so I keep reaching for them." This is painful, but it is also deeply human. Attachment is not some strange flaw found only in the emotionally weak. It is a common expression of unmet needs, unresolved fear, and a mind that has learned to depend on external closeness to regulate inner pain. It often begins long before romance. It begins in the places where the nervous system first learned what connection meant. If love was once inconsistent, attention unpredictable, tenderness conditional, or care mixed with absence, the mind may grow up confusing insecurity with intimacy. It may begin to believe that longing means depth, that emotional chaos means passion, that uncertainty means the bond is special because it hurts so much to lose. Then later in life, when a relationship awakens those old feelings, something powerful happens. The person does not just feel drawn to the other. They feel pulled into an old emotional story, a story where love must be chased, preserved, protected, earned, or constantly monitored. This is why attachment can feel so convincing. It is not only about the present person, it is often connected to older wounds that were never fully seen. Buddhism teaches that suffering grows when the mind clings, not simply when it loves, but when it grasps. Grasping is different from caring. Grasping says, "I cannot be okay unless this remains exactly as I need it to remain." It tries to hold life still. It tries to freeze people into roles. It turns affection into possession and uncertainty into torment. And yet people rarely notice this while it is happening. They call it missing someone. They call it being romantic. They call it loyalty. They call it fighting for love. But inside, there is often fear. Fear of being left. Fear of being replaced. Fear of being forgotten. Fear that if this person goes, some unbearable truth about personal worth will be exposed. That is not the same as love. That is emotional dependency wrapped in beautiful words. A dependent heart does not relate to another person as they are. It relates to what that person provides emotionally. Attention becomes medicine. Reassurance becomes oxygen. Presence becomes proof of value. The relationship may look close from the outside, but inside it is often fueled by a quiet panic. That panic creates blindness. A person overlooks obvious imbalance because they are attached to potential. They excuse emotional inconsistency because they are afraid of loss. They keep reading meaning into crumbs because they do not know how to accept that what they are receiving is not enough. Attachment does this. It clouds clear seeing. This is why Buddhist practice places so much importance on mindfulness. Mindfulness is not just about calming down. It is about seeing clearly. It is about noticing what is actually happening inside the mind before the mind turns it into a fantasy, a story, or a prison. When mindfulness enters attachment, it begins to reveal uncomfortable truths. It reveals how much of the suffering comes not from the other person alone, but from the mind's desperate insistence that things should be different. It reveals how much energy is spent trying to secure, predict, and preserve something that is naturally uncertain. It reveals how often people are not grieving the relationship itself, but the collapse of the identity they built around being needed, wanted, or chosen. And this seeing can feel heartbreaking at first, because people often discover that what they thought was pure love was mixed with fear in ways they never admitted. They wanted closeness, yes, but they also wanted control. They wanted certainty. They wanted guaranteed emotional return. They wanted the other person to silence the deeper ache inside them. Love cannot carry that burden without becoming distorted. This is why attachment becomes heavy so quickly. It asks another human being to do something no human being can do perfectly. It asks them to make the self feel permanently safe. It asks them to end old pain. It asks them to remain stable enough to calm an inner instability they did not create. And when they fail, as all humans eventually do in some way, the attached mind feels devastated, not just disappointed, but shaken at the level of identity. Buddhist wisdom offers something radical here. It says the suffering is not proof that the bond is sacred. It is often proof that the mind has become entangled. Entanglement is not tenderness. Entanglement is confusion. It is the loss of emotional boundaries. It is the inability to tell where care ends and fear begins. It is the habit of making another person's behavior the ruler of your own inner state. This is why genuine compassion feels so different. Compassion does not cling. Compassion does not demand that another person behave a certain way so that the self can remain stable. Compassion sees clearly. It cares without collapsing. It stays open without turning desperate. It can grieve without becoming possessed by grief. It can love someone without making them the center of its worth. This does not mean compassion is cold. It is actually warmer than attachment because it is not trying to use the other person to fill a hole. It is not bargaining. It is not secretly asking, "Please make me feel complete." Compassion says, "I care for your suffering. I care for your humanity. I care for your well-being. But I do not need to imprison you, chase you, or lose myself to prove that care is real." That kind of love is rare because it requires inner stability. It requires a self that is not constantly seeking rescue through other people. It requires enough awareness to notice when longing is no longer connection, but compulsion. Compulsion is one of attachment's clearest signs. The mind keeps returning to the person not because there is peace there, but because there is unfinished emotional hunger there. The thoughts become repetitive. The hope becomes stubborn. The body becomes addicted to tiny signs of closeness. A delayed reply can ruin a day. A little affection can create a flood of relief. The whole experience begins to feel less like love and more like withdrawal and reward. This is why attachment can become so hard to release. It does not just live in the heart. It lives in the habits of the mind and body. It becomes a cycle. Pain leads to reaching. Reaching leads to temporary comfort. Temporary comfort strengthens the dependence. Then distance returns, and the cycle begins again. Without awareness, a person can live inside this pattern for years and call it fate. But Buddhism gently interrupts that illusion. It says, look closely. Look at what this connection is doing to your mind. Look at whether it brings clarity or confusion. Look at whether it expands your humanity or reduces it to waiting, pleasing, hoping, and fearing. Look at whether your love has become mixed with grasping. Because grasping always suffers. It suffers because life cannot be held still. People change. Feelings change. Closeness changes. Circumstances change. Attachment fights this truth. It says, no, stay exactly this way. Stay where I can reach you. Stay where I can rely on you to regulate my emotions. But impermanence remains. And what the attached mind experiences as personal injury is often simply the pain of reality not obeying fear. This is not easy to accept. The human heart wants guarantees. It wants promises that stay true forever. It wants certainty that if it gives enough, loves enough, sacrifices enough, then it will not be left in the cold. But Buddhist teaching keeps returning to one difficult liberation. There are no lasting guarantees in the world of form. Everything changes. Every bond lives under the law of impermanence. Every person is touched by distance, mood, growth, confusion, aging, and loss. This truth can sound harsh until its deeper gift is understood. If nothing external can be made permanently secure, then building your worth on external closeness will always create fear. That fear can never fully rest, because it is trying to find permanence in what is naturally changing. This is why attachment remains anxious, even in good moments. Even when the relationship is going well, the attached mind is secretly nervous. It knows how much it has placed on this one connection. It knows how much collapse would come if this source of comfort disappeared. So it cannot fully enjoy the love. It is too busy guarding it. Love guarded by fear does not feel free. It feels fragile. This fragility often produces behaviors that slowly damage the very bond a person is trying to protect. They overread everything. They ask for reassurance again and again. They test the relationship. They become hypersensitive to tone. They silence their own truth to avoid conflict, then build resentment. They cling tighter when the other person needs space. And then, when the other person withdraws under that pressure, the attachment grows even stronger. The mind says, "See, I was right to be afraid." But the fear itself helped create the pain. This does not mean people are to blame for their wounds. It means wounds left unattended begin to shape the way love is experienced. They become filters. The person does not see the relationship clearly because they are seeing through the lens of old hunger. Old hunger is powerful. It can make inconsistency feel magnetic. It can make emotionally unavailable people feel important. It can make the smallest signs of warmth feel unforgettable because they are touching something ancient inside. And yet that ancient ache cannot be healed by clinging. This is where Buddhist practice becomes deeply healing, not just intellectually comforting. Meditation, self-inquiry, and mindful observation begin to uncover what is truly being sought beneath the attachment. Often, it is not even the person alone. It is safety. It is worth. It is soothing. It is permission to rest. It is the dream of finally feeling chosen in a way that makes old pain disappear. Once that is seen, something changes. The person begins to understand that no relationship can permanently heal a self that is still abandoned from within. Love can support healing. It can nourish growth. It can offer companionship and tenderness. But it cannot replace the inner work of becoming present to your own fear, your own emptiness, your own unmet sorrow. Attachment wants the other person to do that work for you. Compassion turns inward and says, "Let me sit with what I keep asking others to erase." That is a sacred turning. It is the moment a person stops confusing rescue with love. It is the moment they begin to care for the frightened parts of themselves instead of making another human being responsible for keeping those parts quiet. This inner compassion is not selfish. It is necessary. Without it, a person keeps entering relationships as a beggar of emotional certainty. With it, they begin to enter as a whole human being who can love deeply without disappearing into fear. Wholeness does not mean never needing anyone. It does not mean becoming detached in the cold sense, numb or unreachable. Buddhism does not ask people to stop loving. It asks them to stop clinging. There is a great difference between the two. To love without clinging is to let affection move through honesty instead of fear. It is to allow care without possession. It is to cherish without making the other person the container of your worth. It is to welcome connection while knowing that your deepest center cannot be handed over to anyone else. This kind of love has dignity in it. It can say, "I care about you," without saying, "Without you, I am nothing." It can say, "I will miss you," without saying, "I cannot survive your absence." It can say, "This matters to me," without saying, "My entire identity now depends on how you respond." That is freedom inside connection. And freedom is one of the clearest signs that attachment is loosening. When attachment begins to soften, the mind becomes less dramatic. It stops treating every change in closeness as a crisis. It no longer sees distance as proof of worthlessness. It becomes capable of pausing before reacting. It can feel longing without turning longing into a command. It can feel disappointment without building a temple around it. It begins to understand that pain is part of being human, but bondage is not the same thing as love. This is where genuine peace enters. Not because the heart stops caring, but because it no longer builds a cage around what it cares about. And strangely, this is often what allows healthier love to appear. When the desperate grasping softens, perception clears. A person can finally see who is actually available, who is capable of reciprocity, who brings steadiness instead of addiction, who offers warmth without demanding self-loss. They stop confusing intensity with sincerity. They stop treating emotional turbulence as chemistry. They stop calling anxiety a soulmate bond. They become quieter inside. And in that quiet, wisdom becomes possible. The Buddhist path does not humiliate attachment. It does not shame people for clinging. It understands that clinging is often the mind's frightened attempt to avoid pain. It is what people do when they do not yet know how to rest, in uncertainty, how to comfort themselves, how to trust their own worth without constant proof. So the invitation is not self-judgment. It is awareness. See the attachment clearly. See where fear has dressed itself in the language of love. See where dependency has been mistaken for devotion. See where the other person has been turned into a solution for an inner ache that only deeper self-understanding can truly meet. Then, gently, begin to loosen your grip, not by forcing indifference, but by returning to truth. By remembering that love is not proven by suffering, by remembering that compassion never asks you to abandon your center, by remembering that another person can be precious without becoming your emotional ruler, by remembering that the heart is strongest not when it clings the hardest, but when it learns how to remain open without becoming imprisoned. And as this understanding deepens, the whole meaning of love begins to change. Love is no longer a frantic attempt to secure belonging. It becomes a practice of presence, a practice of honesty, a practice of care that does not demand ownership, a practice of meeting another person with warmth while staying rooted in the part of yourself that does not disappear when they move closer or farther away. That rootedness is what attachment can never offer. Attachment promises closeness but delivers fear. Compassion offers closeness without fear controlling the whole experience. And once that difference is felt, really felt, the heart begins to mature. Not harden, not shut down. Mature. It becomes less interested in being consumed and more interested in what is true, less attracted to emotional chaos and more drawn to peace, less willing to call suffering love just because it is intense. This is a quiet awakening. And it matters because the more clearly you see attachment, the less likely you are to worship what is actually wounding you. Then the heart can finally begin to love in a way that honors both connection and freedom. And from that place, another truth begins to rise. Not every bond that feels strong is healthy. Not every closeness that feels intoxicating is safe. Not every relationship that keeps your heart occupied is actually helping you remain yourself. Sometimes the greatest danger is not that someone leaves. It is that in trying to keep them, you slowly lose the shape of who you are. And that is where the next lesson must go. Because once attachment has been seen for what it is, another sorrow becomes impossible to ignore. The quiet way identity begins to erode when the whole self is organized around pleasing, adapting, and staying emotionally acceptable. And this is where the pattern becomes even more quiet and even more dangerous. Because once attachment has been seen, something deeper begins to reveal itself. The problem was never only how tightly you held on to others, it was also how easily you let go of yourself. At first, it did not feel like loss. It felt like care. It felt like maturity. It felt like doing the right thing to keep the connection safe. But over time, something inside you began to fade. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly enough that you could keep going without noticing what was disappearing. And this is where the next truth must be faced. Something important was given up long before you realized it. There is a quiet kind of sadness that does not come from rejection or loss. It comes from realizing that you have been present in your own life, but not fully there. You spoke, but not with your real voice. You agreed, but not with your real feelings. You stayed, but not with your full self. It is a strange kind of absence because from the outside, everything looks normal. You show up, you respond, you participate, you maintain relationships. People may even describe you as kind, easy to be around, understanding, supportive. But inside, there is a subtle disconnection. Something does not feel entirely true. This is the silent erosion of identity. It does not begin with big sacrifices. It begins with small adjustments that seem harmless at first. You laugh when something does not feel funny. You say yes when you want to say no. You soften your opinions to avoid tension. You let certain things slide, not because they are okay, but because addressing them feels risky. Each moment seems insignificant on its own, but together they create a pattern. And that pattern slowly reshapes who you are. You begin to notice that your reactions are less about what you truly feel and more about what will keep things smooth. Your decisions are less about what aligns with your values and more about what will be accepted. Your silence becomes more frequent, not because you have nothing to say, but because speaking feels inconvenient to others. And without realizing it, your identity begins to revolve around external comfort rather than internal truth. This is not something most people consciously choose. It happens because the need to belong is powerful. The mind learns early that connection often comes with conditions. Approval feels good. Acceptance feels safe. Being liked creates a sense of stability, and so the mind adapts. It begins to prioritize those experiences, even if it means moving away from authenticity. Over time, this adaptation becomes automatic. You do not pause to ask what you truly think or feel. You go straight to what will maintain harmony. You become skilled at reading others, anticipating their reactions, adjusting your tone, your words, even your personality. This skill can make you appear socially intelligent, but inside it creates confusion, because the more you adapt, the less clear you become about who you actually are. Your preferences begin to blur. What do you really enjoy, and what have you learned to enjoy because it keeps others comfortable? What do you truly believe, and what have you agreed with simply to avoid disagreement? What do you genuinely want, and what have you convinced yourself to want because it fits into someone else's expectations? These questions can feel unsettling because the answers are not always obvious. When identity has been shaped by pleasing others for a long time, the original self becomes harder to access. It is not gone, but it is buried under layers of habit, fear, and adaptation. This is why many people feel a strange emptiness, even when their relationships are intact. They are connected to others, but disconnected from themselves. They are valued for their presence, but not known for their truth. They are appreciated, but not fully seen. And the most painful part is this: even if someone truly wants to know you, they cannot fully do so if you are not showing up as yourself. So the connection, no matter how close it appears, remains incomplete. Buddhist wisdom speaks directly to this kind of suffering. It teaches that when you lose awareness of your own inner experience, you lose connection with your true nature, not because the self disappears, but because attention has been redirected outward for too long. You become more aware of others than you are of yourself. You notice their moods, their preferences, their expectations, their comfort levels, but you stop noticing your own inner signals. The subtle discomfort when something feels wrong. The quiet resistance when you are about to agree to something that does not align. The inner voice that says, "This is not right for me." At first, that voice is still there. But when it is ignored repeatedly, it becomes quieter. Not because it has nothing to say, but because it has learned that it is not being listened to. This is how self-trust begins to weaken. And when self-trust weakens, self-worth often follows. Because if you are not honoring your own truth, even in small ways, something inside you begins to question your value, not consciously, but subtly. There is a growing sense that your needs matter less, your feelings are less important, your perspective is less valid. This belief does not need to be spoken out loud to have power. It shows up in your behavior. You hesitate before expressing yourself. You second-guess your reactions. You seek reassurance for decisions you once would have made confidently. You become more dependent on others to confirm what is acceptable, and slowly your inner authority begins to fade. This is not because you lack strength. It is because you have been practicing self-dismissal. Every time you silence your truth to maintain approval, you are teaching your mind that external validation matters more than internal clarity. And over time, this becomes the default way of living. Buddhism encourages a return to awareness as the first step toward reversing this pattern. Awareness is not about forcing change immediately. It is about seeing clearly what is happening in each moment. When you notice that you are about to agree with something that does not feel right, that is awareness. When you feel a tightness in your body as you say yes to something you do not want, that is awareness. When you realize that you are adjusting your behavior to avoid discomfort rather than to express truth, that is awareness. This awareness does not judge, it simply reveals. And in that revealing, something begins to shift. Because once you see the pattern, you can no longer fully pretend that it is not there. This does not mean you will change everything overnight. In fact, trying to force sudden change can create more resistance. Instead, the process is gradual. You begin by acknowledging your own experience more. Honestly, you admit to yourself when something feels off. You allow your feelings to exist without immediately dismissing them. You start to listen to the inner voice that has been quiet for so long. At first, it may feel unfamiliar because you are not used to prioritizing it. But with time, it becomes clearer. And as it becomes clearer, it becomes easier to follow. This is how identity begins to restore itself. Not through dramatic declarations, but through small acts of alignment. You speak a little more honestly in situations where you would have stayed silent. You set a boundary in a place where you would have previously agreed. You express a preference even if it creates slight discomfort. You choose authenticity over approval, even in subtle ways. Each of these moments strengthens your connection to yourself. Each one rebuilds a sense of inner stability. And over time, this stability becomes something you can rely on. It does not mean that relationships become easy. In fact, they may become more complex at first. Because when you stop shaping yourself around others, the dynamic changes. Some people may resist this change. They may be used to a version of you that is always agreeable, always accommodating, always available. When that version begins to shift, it can create tension. This is where fear often returns. The fear of losing connection, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being seen differently. But this is also where a deeper truth becomes clear. Any connection that depends on you not being yourself is not a stable connection. It may feel familiar, it may feel comfortable, but it is not built on truth. And truth is the foundation of anything that lasts. Buddhist teaching emphasizes that right relationship begins with right understanding. Understanding of yourself, your needs, your boundaries, your nature. Without this understanding, relationships become performance-based. You perform kindness, you perform agreement, you perform ease. But performance cannot sustain intimacy because intimacy requires presence, and presence requires authenticity. When you begin to return to yourself, relationships that are capable of growth will adapt, they will deepen, they will become more honest, more balanced, more real. Relationships that cannot adapt may fall away. And while this can feel painful, it is also part of the process. Because what remains is no longer based on your ability to disappear. It is based on your willingness to be seen. And that kind of connection, even if fewer in number, carries a different quality. It feels more stable, more respectful, more aligned, more peaceful. As identity begins to restore itself, something else changes as well. Your sense of worth becomes less dependent on external response, not because you no longer care about others, but because you are no longer building your value around their reactions. You start to understand that your truth does not need universal agreement to be valid. Your needs do not need constant approval to matter. Your presence does not need to be shaped into something else to be acceptable. This understanding creates a quiet confidence, not loud, not performative, not demanding, but steady. It allows you to move through relationships with more clarity. You can appreciate others without losing yourself in them. You can care without overextending. You can give without depleting. You can listen without abandoning your own perspective. This balance is what was missing before, and it is what begins to restore a sense of wholeness. The silent erosion of identity does not happen because people are weak. It happens because people are trying to protect connection. But when protection of connection comes at the cost of self, the result is always imbalance. Buddhist wisdom does not ask you to choose between yourself and others. It asks you to include yourself in the circle of care. to recognize that your inner experience matters, to understand that compassion without self-respect becomes self-neglect, to see that harmony built on suppression is not true harmony, and to realize that the path back to yourself is not about becoming someone new, but about removing what is not true, layer by layer, moment by moment, choice by choice, until what remains is something simple, something real, something that no longer needs to be shaped to fit into someone else's expectations, something that can exist fully even in the presence of others. And as this becomes more stable, another realization begins to rise. It is no longer just about losing yourself to keep others happy. It is also about understanding why rejection, when it comes, feels so deeply personal. Because once identity has been built around external acceptance, any withdrawal of that acceptance does not feel like a simple change in circumstance. It feels like a statement about your value. And this is where the next layer of understanding must unfold. And this is where the wound becomes sharper. Because once a person begins to see how much of their identity has been shaped around others, another realization quietly follows. It is no longer only about losing yourself to keep connection. It is about what happens when that connection is taken away. When someone pulls back, leaves, or simply stops choosing you, the pain does not stay on the surface. It travels deeper. It reaches into the place where your worth was tied to their presence, and it shakes it. And this is where rejection begins to feel like something much bigger than it actually is. It starts to feel like proof. A quiet question begins to rise. What if the pain was never just about them leaving? There is a moment after rejection that feels heavier than the event itself. It is not the silence, not the absence, not even the distance. It is the meaning that forms around it. The mind does not stay with what happened. It begins to interpret. It starts asking questions that sound simple but carry weight. Why did they leave? What did I do wrong? What do they see that I do not? And slowly, almost without resistance, these questions begin to form an answer. I was not enough. This conclusion does not arrive loudly. It settles quietly, like a truth that feels obvious. It begins to shape how you see yourself, not just in that relationship, but in others. It becomes a lens, a silent assumption that sits behind your thoughts. And the more often rejection has been experienced in life, the easier this conclusion feels, because the mind looks for patterns. It collects moments. It remembers the times you were overlooked, ignored, compared, replaced, misunderstood. It connects them into a story, and that story becomes identity, not consciously, but deeply. This is why rejection does not feel like a single moment. It feels like confirmation. Confirmation of something that has been feared for a long time. And this is where the pain becomes personal. Not because the other person has defined your value, but because your value was already being measured through their response. When self-worth is built externally, every reaction from others becomes information about who you are. If they stay, you feel worthy. If they leave, you feel lacking. If they respond warmly, you feel accepted. If they withdraw, you feel rejected, not just in behavior, but in identity. This is a fragile way to exist, because it places your sense of self in a place you cannot control. And when something is out of your control, the mind becomes restless. It tries to figure out how to fix what happened. It replays conversations. It reanalyzes behavior. It imagines different outcomes. It tries to rewrite the past to avoid the present. But no matter how much it thinks, the conclusion often remains the same. Something about me was not enough. Buddhist wisdom looks at this suffering and responds differently. It does not deny the pain of rejection. It does not pretend that loss is easy. But it questions the meaning that the mind attaches to it. It asks a deeper question. Is what happened truly a statement about your worth, or is it a reflection of conditions? Conditions include many things: timing, emotional capacity, personal history, unspoken expectations, compatibility, individual struggles, unresolved wounds, different values, different paths. All of these shape how people behave in relationships, and none of them are simple. When someone leaves, it is rarely because of one clear reason. It is often a combination of factors that exist beyond what can be seen or understood fully. But the mind does not like complexity. It prefers simple explanations, and the simplest explanation is often the most painful one. It was me. This belief feels convincing because it creates a sense of control. If the problem is you, then maybe you can fix it. Maybe you can improve. Maybe you can become better, more attractive, more interesting, more understanding, more patient. Maybe next time you can avoid being left. But this is where the trap deepens, because the attempt to fix yourself in response to rejection is often not about growth. It is about fear. Fear of experiencing that pain again, fear of not being chosen again, fear of confirming the belief that you are not enough. And so the mind begins to adjust, not in alignment with truth, but in alignment with avoidance. It becomes more careful, more guarded, more eager to please, more sensitive to signs of withdrawal, more dependent on reassurance. And in doing so, it strengthens the very pattern that created the suffering in the first place. Buddhism teaches that suffering increases when the mind clings to identity. Not identity in the sense of personality, but identity in the sense of fixed conclusions about the self. When you believe deeply that rejection means you are not enough, you are creating a fixed identity. And the mind will begin to protect that identity. It will look for evidence that confirms it. It will interpret neutral situations as negative. It will assume distance where there may be none. It will expect rejection even before it happens, and in doing so, it creates a reality that feels consistent with the belief. This is not because the belief is true, it is because the mind is powerful in shaping perception. This is why two people can experience the same situation and feel completely different about it. One may see rejection as a mismatch. The other may see it as a personal failure. The difference is not in the event, it is in the meaning. And meaning is not fixed, it is created. This is where Buddhist practice becomes deeply transformative. It teaches that thoughts are not facts, that the mind creates narratives, but those narratives are not always true. That identity is not something permanent, but something that changes, evolves, and can be questioned. When rejection happens, instead of immediately accepting the thought, "I was not enough," there is space to observe it, to see it as a thought, to notice how it feels in the body, to recognize its familiarity, to understand that it is a pattern, not a truth. This does not remove the pain instantly, but it creates distance from the belief, and in that distance, something new becomes possible: curiosity. What else could this mean? What other explanations exist? What part of this situation is not about me? What conditions may have influenced their choice? This kind of inquiry does not deny responsibility. It simply refuses to reduce your entire worth to one outcome, because no single experience can define the value of a human being. That value is not measured by who stays. It is not measured by how others respond. It is not measured by approval, attention, or acceptance. It exists independently of all of these things. But this is not something the mind understands easily, because the mind has been trained to look outward, to seek validation, to compare, to measure, to evaluate. So returning inward feels unfamiliar. It feels uncertain. It feels like stepping into something that cannot be confirmed by others. But this is where true stability begins. When you no longer need external confirmation to know that your existence has value. This does not mean you become indifferent to rejection. It does not mean you stop caring about relationships. It means that your sense of self is no longer at risk every time something does not work out. It remains intact. It remains grounded. It remains present. This changes the experience of rejection completely. It still hurts, but it does not define you. It becomes something you feel, not something you become. This distinction is important, because when you become the pain, you lose perspective. When you feel the pain, you can move through it. Buddhist teaching often returns to the idea of impermanence. Everything changes. Feelings rise and fall. Experiences come and go. People enter and leave. Nothing stays the same. Rejection, like everything else, is part of this flow. It is not a permanent state. It is not a final judgment. It is a moment, a difficult one, but still a moment. When you begin to see it this way, the urgency around it begins to soften. You no longer feel the need to solve it immediately. You no longer feel the need to understand everything at once. You allow space for the experience to unfold, and in that space, healing begins. Not because you found the perfect explanation, but because you stopped attaching your identity to the event. This is where compassion becomes essential. Not compassion for the other person, but for yourself. To recognize that feeling hurt is natural, that longing for connection is human, that wanting to be chosen is not a flaw, but also to recognize that your worth is not dependent on the outcome of any one relationship. This balance is what creates resilience, not the absence of pain, but the ability to experience pain without losing yourself. As this understanding deepens, something else begins to change. Your relationship with connection becomes more grounded. You no longer approach relationships as a way to prove your worth. You approach them as an experience of sharing your life. You no longer try to earn love. You allow it to meet you where you are. You no longer chase approval. You recognize when something aligns and when it does not. This does not guarantee that rejection will never happen again, but it changes how you experience it. When it does, it becomes information, not identity. It becomes part of the path, not the end of it. And from this place, a different kind of strength begins to emerge. Quiet, steady, unshaken by external response. A strength that does not need to prove itself. A strength that does not collapse when things change. A strength that comes from knowing that your value is not something that can be taken away. It was never given by others to begin with. And as this becomes clearer, another layer of understanding begins to rise. Because even with this awareness, there is still something that pulls people into patterns where they shape themselves to fit what others need. Not just to avoid rejection, but to feel necessary, to feel wanted, to feel important. And this leads into a deeper question. And this is where the pattern deepens in a way that is harder to see. Because even after understanding that rejection does not define your worth, there can still be a quiet pull to avoid that pain at all costs. And one of the most common ways the mind tries to protect itself is by becoming whatever it believes will be accepted, not just adjusting once in a while, but reshaping again and again until it feels natural, until it feels like identity. Something subtle begins to happen. You stop asking what is true for you, and you start asking what will make you easier to keep. There is a quiet habit that forms when the fear of losing people becomes stronger than the desire to be real. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not feel like a decision. It feels like survival. You enter a space, and without thinking, you begin to scan. What kind of energy is needed here? What version of me will be received well? What tone will keep things smooth? What reactions will avoid tension? And before you even realize it, you have already adjusted. Your voice shifts, your opinions soften, your personality bends just enough to fit into what feels acceptable. And the strange part is, this ability often gets rewarded. People respond positively. They feel comfortable around you. They find you easy to connect with. They describe you as adaptable, understanding, agreeable, but beneath that surface, something else is forming, a quiet distance between who you are and who you are being. This distance grows not because you are trying to deceive others, but because you are trying to maintain connection. And that intention feels good. It feels caring. It feels like you are doing what is necessary to keep things working, but the cost is hidden. Because when you shapeshift too often, you begin to lose track of your original shape. At first, you still remember who you are. You know what you like, what you believe, what you feel. But over time, as the adjustments become more frequent, those things begin to blur. Not completely, but enough to create confusion. You start to hesitate before expressing a thought, not because it is unclear, but because you are unsure how it will be received. You begin to question your own reactions, wondering if they are appropriate, if they are too much, if they might disrupt something. You learn to hold back, not in a dramatic way, but in small, consistent ways that slowly reshape your behavior. And this is how the trap forms, because the more you adjust, the more you are rewarded with acceptance. And the more you are rewarded, the more you repeat the behavior, until eventually it becomes automatic. You are no longer consciously choosing to shape yourself, you are simply doing it. And at that point, it becomes difficult to stop, because stopping feels risky. If this version of you is what people like, what happens if you return to your original self? Will they still respond the same way? Will they still stay? Will they still choose you? These questions create fear, and that fear keeps the pattern in place. Buddhist wisdom looks at this pattern and recognizes it as a form of suffering rooted in attachment and identity confusion. Not attachment only to people, but attachment to the idea of being accepted, and identity not as something stable, but as something constantly shifting based on external response. When identity is built this way, it becomes unstable, because it depends on something that is always changing. People change, situations change, expectations change, and so the version of you that is accepted in one moment may not be accepted in another. This creates pressure, a constant need to stay aware of what is required, a constant effort to adjust, to fit, to remain acceptable. And this effort becomes exhausting, not physically, but emotionally. There is a kind of fatigue that comes from never fully resting in who you are, from always being slightly outside of yourself, monitoring, adjusting, performing. This is the hidden prison, because from the outside, everything looks fine. You are connected, you are included, you are valued, but inside there is no real rest, because rest requires authenticity, and authenticity requires risk. The risk of not being accepted, the risk of not being liked, the risk of not fitting into what others expect. And when that risk feels too great, performance becomes the safer option. But safety built on performance is fragile, because it requires constant effort. And effort, over time, leads to strain. This strain may not be obvious at first. It may appear as subtle tension, a feeling of being slightly off, a sense that something is missing, even when everything seems to be in place. It may show up as difficulty making decisions, because when you are used to adapting to others, your own preferences become less clear. It may appear as resentment, not toward others directly, but toward the situation. A quiet frustration that builds when your needs are consistently set aside. It may manifest as anxiety, because constantly adjusting requires constant awareness, and constant awareness creates pressure. All of these are signals, not of weakness, but of misalignment. Buddhist teaching emphasizes the importance of right view, seeing things as they are, not as the mind wants them to be. And when applied to this pattern, right view reveals something important. The acceptance you are receiving is not for your true self. It is for the version you are presenting. And while that version may be close to who you are, it is not complete. It is shaped, filtered, edited. And because of that, it cannot fully satisfy the deeper need for connection. Because real connection requires being seen as you are, not as you appear. This creates a paradox. The more you shape yourself to be accepted, the less you feel truly accepted, because what is being accepted is not fully you, and something inside you knows that. This knowing may not always be clear, but it is present. It creates a subtle discomfort, a feeling that the connection, while real in some ways, is not fully grounded, that something is missing, and what is missing is authenticity. Buddhism teaches that the self is not something fixed, but it also teaches that there is a natural state of being that is not constructed through fear or adaptation. This natural state is not rigid, it is flexible, but it is not reactive. It does not change based on what will be accepted. It changes based on understanding, growth, and truth. Returning to this state requires awareness, the ability to notice when you are shifting out of alignment, the ability to pause before adjusting, the willingness to feel discomfort rather than immediately smoothing it over. This is not easy, because discomfort feels like danger, especially when connection has been tied to acceptance. But discomfort is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes it is a sign that something is real. When you express a thought that may not be fully accepted, there may be tension. When you set a boundary, there may be resistance. When you show a part of yourself that is not polished, there may be uncertainty. These moments feel uncomfortable, but they are also honest. And honesty is what allows connection to become deeper, not wider, but deeper. Because when you show up as you are, the response you receive is based on truth. And truth, even when it leads to rejection, is more stable than acceptance built on performance. This is where freedom begins to emerge, not in the absence of connection, but in the absence of constant adaptation. When you no longer feel the need to become something else to be accepted, you begin to experience a different kind of stability, one that comes from within, one that does not shift with every interaction, one that allows you to engage with others without losing yourself in the process. This does not mean you stop being considerate. It does not mean you ignore the needs of others. It means that your own presence remains intact. You listen, but you also feel. You respond, but you also remain grounded. You adapt, but not at the cost of your core. This balance is what has been missing, and it is what begins to restore a sense of wholeness. As this wholeness develops, something else changes. The need to perform begins to decrease, not because you no longer care about connection, but because you no longer need to earn it. You begin to understand that the right connections do not require constant adjustment. They allow space, they allow difference, they allow individuality. And when that space is present, there is less pressure to become something else. There is more room to simply be. This being is not passive. It is active in a different way. It requires awareness, honesty, and courage. But it does not require constant effort to maintain an image. And that is where real ease begins. Not ease in the sense of everything being perfect, but ease in the sense of not having to hold yourself together artificially. This is what Buddhist practice points toward. Not the elimination of relationships, but the purification of how you exist within them. To move from performance to presence, from adaptation to authenticity, from fear-based connection to truth-based connection. And as this shift continues, another realization begins to form, because even when you stop shape-shifting, even when you return to yourself, there can still be a deep craving for love that pulls you back into patterns of seeking, chasing, and depending. And this leads into the next layer of understanding. And this is where something even more subtle begins to reveal itself, because after stepping out of the habit of becoming whatever others need, after slowly returning to your own voice, your own truth, your own center, there can still remain a quiet pull inside you. A pull that does not come from others, but from within. It is not always loud. It does not always look desperate, but it is there. The desire to feel loved, seen, chosen, valued. And this desire, when it becomes a craving, can lead you right back into the same patterns you thought you had left behind. A quiet emptiness often hides beneath the search for love. It is not the kind of emptiness that comes from being alone. It is deeper than that. It feels like something is missing, something that cannot be named clearly but is felt constantly. A sense that something inside you is incomplete. And when this feeling appears, the mind begins to move. It starts looking outward. It searches for someone who can fill that space, someone who can provide warmth, reassurance, attention, closeness. At first, this search feels natural. Humans are wired for connection. Wanting love is not wrong, but craving love is different. Craving turns a natural desire into a need that feels urgent, almost necessary for emotional survival. And once something feels necessary for survival, the mind becomes restless. It cannot relax. It cannot sit still. It cannot accept absence. It begins to chase, not always physically, but emotionally. You think about the person constantly. You check your phone more often. You wait for signs. You look for reassurance. You try to secure the feeling of being wanted. And in doing so, something important happens. Your attention leaves the present moment. It becomes focused on what is not there yet, or what might disappear. This creates a subtle tension, because instead of being grounded in your own experience, you are leaning towards something external to complete you. This leaning creates imbalance, and that imbalance is felt as emptiness. The more you reach outward to fill the space, the more you become aware of the space itself, because the mind is now trained to look at what is missing. Buddhist teaching describes this as craving, a force that keeps the mind in a state of dissatisfaction. Not because life is lacking, but because the mind is constantly comparing what is with what it wants. And when it does this, the present moment is never enough. There is always something else needed, something more, something better. In the context of love, this becomes particularly intense, because emotional connection carries a strong sense of relief. When someone responds, when they show care, when they offer attention, there is a moment of fullness, a sense that the emptiness has been filled. But this fullness is temporary, because it is dependent on something outside of you, and anything outside of you is subject to change. So the moment that response fades, even slightly, the emptiness returns, sometimes stronger than before, because now you have experienced the contrast. You know what it feels like to be filled, and so the absence feels deeper. This creates a cycle. Craving leads to temporary satisfaction. Satisfaction fades, emptiness returns, craving intensifies, and the cycle continues. This is why chasing love often makes the emptiness worse. Not because love is harmful, but because the way it is being approached reinforces the sense of lack. Each time you seek validation to feel whole, you are confirming the belief that you are not whole without it. This belief becomes stronger with repetition, and over time, it shapes how you experience yourself. You begin to feel incomplete when alone, restless when not receiving attention, uneasy when things are uncertain, dependent on external signs to feel stable. This is not a failure, it is a learned pattern, but it is a pattern that creates suffering, because it places your sense of fullness in a place you cannot control, and control becomes the next layer of struggle. The mind tries to maintain the connection. It tries to keep the other person engaged. It tries to secure their attention, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly. You may overthink your messages, you may adjust your behavior, you may give more than you receive, you may tolerate inconsistency, all in an effort to keep the feeling of being filled. But this effort does not lead to peace. It leads to exhaustion, because you are constantly working to maintain something that cannot be held permanently. Buddhism teaches that true peace does not come from fulfilling craving. It comes from understanding it, from seeing it clearly, from recognizing how it operates. When you begin to observe craving, you notice its nature. It is always reaching, always wanting, always dissatisfied. Even when it gets what it wants, it does not stay satisfied for long. It moves on to the next desire, the next need, the next source of validation. This movement prevents stillness, because the mind is always in motion, always looking ahead, always searching. And without stillness, there is no opportunity to experience completeness. Stillness is where a different kind of fullness begins to appear. Not the kind that comes from being filled by something else, but the kind that comes from not needing to be filled. This is a subtle shift. It does not happen through force, it happens through awareness. When you stop chasing for a moment, even briefly, you begin to notice what is already present. Your breath, your body, your thoughts, your feelings. At first, this may feel uncomfortable because the emptiness is still there, and without distraction, it becomes more noticeable. But if you stay with it, something changes. The emptiness begins to soften, not because it has been filled, but because it has been acknowledged. There is a difference between emptiness that is resisted and emptiness that is accepted. Resisted emptiness feels sharp. It demands attention. It pushes you to act. Accepted emptiness feels different. It is still present, but it is not overwhelming. It becomes something you can sit with, something you can observe, something that does not define you. This is where inner stillness begins. Not in the absence of feeling, but in the absence of struggle against feeling. When you no longer see emptiness as something that must be fixed immediately, it loses some of its power. It becomes part of your experience, not the center of it. And from this place, something unexpected happens. A sense of space begins to open. A space where you are not constantly reaching, a space where you can simply exist. And in that space, there is a quiet kind of peace. Not intense, not overwhelming, but steady. This peace does not depend on whether someone responds to you. It does not fluctuate with attention. It is not tied to external validation. It comes from being present with yourself, without needing to change what is there. This does not mean that you stop wanting love. It means that your relationship with that desire changes. You no longer see it as something that must be fulfilled to feel complete. You see it as a natural part of being human, but not the source of your identity. This changes how you engage with others. You are no longer chasing to fill a void. You are connecting from a place of presence. This kind of connection feels different. It is lighter, less pressured, less dependent, more genuine. Because it is not driven by fear. It is driven by openness. You can appreciate someone without needing them to complete you. You can enjoy connection without fearing its absence. You can give without expecting something in return. This is where love becomes healthier, not because it is perfect, but because it is not carrying the weight of your emptiness. Your emptiness is no longer something you are trying to escape. It is something you have learned to sit with, and in sitting with it, it transforms. It becomes less of a void and more of a space where you can exist without constant need, a space where you can breathe, a space where you can be. Buddhist wisdom points to this space as the beginning of freedom. Not freedom from desire, but freedom from being controlled by it. When craving no longer drives your actions, you begin to experience life differently. You are less reactive, less anxious, less dependent, more grounded, more present, more stable. This stability is not something that can be given to you. It is something that grows from within, and once it begins to grow, it changes everything, because you are no longer looking for someone to fill you. You are allowing connection to be an addition, not a solution. This is where real peace begins to take root, not in the presence of love, but in the absence of craving. And as this understanding deepens, another question begins to arise. And this is where clarity becomes necessary. Because after seeing how craving creates emptiness, a new kind of awareness begins to rise. It is no longer only about what you feel inside, but about what you are participating in with others. Not every connection nourishes, not every closeness is safe, and not every form of love allows you to remain yourself. So a deeper question begins to surface. There is a quiet line most people never notice. It does not appear suddenly, it does not announce itself, but it exists in every relationship. The line between connection and self-abandonment. At first, both can feel similar. Both involve giving, both involve caring, both involve adjusting at times, both require effort. This is why the difference is not obvious, but over time, the feeling changes. In true connection, there is movement, but there is also stability. You can adjust without losing your center. You can care without forgetting yourself. You can listen without silencing your own voice. In self-abandonment, the balance begins to shift. You still give, but something is not returned. Not necessarily in action, but in presence. Your truth becomes less visible. Your needs become less important. Your inner signals become something you override instead of something you respect. And the shift happens quietly. You do not wake up one day and decide to abandon yourself. It happens in moments, small, repeated moments. You choose silence instead of honesty. You choose comfort instead of truth. You choose keeping the peace instead of respecting your own boundaries. And each time, it feels like the easier option. It feels like the right thing to do. But the accumulation of those moments creates distance, distance from yourself, and this distance is what begins to create suffering. Buddhist teaching speaks of non-harming, not only in relation to others, but in relation to the self. To harm yourself does not always mean something extreme. It can be as simple as ignoring what you know is true, as simple as agreeing to something that does not feel right, as simple as staying in a situation that slowly diminishes your sense of being. This kind of harm is subtle. It does not leave visible marks, but it affects your inner state. It creates tension, a quiet discomfort that does not go away. You may try to ignore it. You may tell yourself it is not important. You may focus on the positive aspects of the connection, but the tension remains, because it is not coming from the situation alone. It is coming from the misalignment between your actions and your truth. This misalignment is the core difference between connection and self-abandonment. Connection allows alignment. Self-abandonment requires misalignment. In connection, you feel seen, not only in the ways you present yourself, but in the ways you actually are. You do not need to hide parts of yourself to maintain closeness. You do not need to perform to be accepted. There is space for your thoughts, your feelings, your boundaries. This space may not always be perfect. There may still be conflict. There may still be moments of misunderstanding, but the foundation remains. You are allowed to exist as you are. In self-abandonment, that space begins to shrink. You become more careful, more selective, more aware of what is acceptable. You start to filter yourself, not because you want to deceive, but because you want to maintain the connection. And this filtering becomes a habit, a way of being. Over time, it becomes difficult to separate what you truly feel from what you allow yourself to express. This creates confusion, not only in how others see you, but in how you see yourself. Because when expression is limited, self-understanding becomes limited as well. You no longer have full access to your own experience. You begin to question your own reactions. You wonder if you are overthinking. You doubt your own boundaries. You hesitate before trusting your own feelings. And this hesitation weakens your sense of self. Buddhism teaches that awareness is the path back to alignment, not through force, but through observation. To notice when something feels off, to recognize when your body tightens instead of relaxes, to see when your words do not match your inner state. These signals are not random, They are information. They are your system communicating that something is not aligned. But when you are focused on maintaining connection, it is easy to ignore them. Because addressing them may create discomfort. It may lead to conflict. It may risk the stability of the relationship. And this is where fear becomes a factor. Fear of losing the connection. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being seen differently. Fear of being rejected. This fear can be strong enough to override awareness. It can convince you that staying silent is better than being honest, that adapting is better than being authentic, that maintaining the connection is more important than maintaining yourself. But this belief has consequences, because when you consistently choose the connection over yourself, you are teaching your mind something, that your presence is conditional, that your truth is negotiable, that your value depends on how well you fit into what others expect. This teaching does not stay limited to one relationship. It spreads. It influences how you approach others, how you see yourself, how you make decisions. It becomes a pattern, and patterns, when repeated, become identity. This is why self-abandonment is not just about one situation. It is about the long-term effect of repeated misalignment. The gradual shaping of a self that is built around external acceptance rather than internal truth. Breaking this pattern requires awareness, but also courage. The courage to notice when you are about to abandon yourself. The courage to pause before adjusting. The courage to choose truth, even when it feels uncomfortable. This does not mean being rigid. It does not mean refusing to compromise. Healthy connection includes flexibility, but flexibility is different from self-erasure. Flexibility allows you to adapt while staying connected to your core. Self-erasure requires you to disconnect from your core entirely. The difference is subtle, but important. In flexibility, you remain aware of your own needs and values. In self-erasure, those needs and values become secondary or invisible. Over time, the absence of your own voice creates imbalance. Because relationships are not meant to be one-sided. They are meant to involve exchange, presence from both sides, expression from both sides, respect from both sides. When one side consistently gives up their truth, the relationship loses balance. And without balance, there is no real stability. It may continue, it may function, but it is not grounded. This is why connection that requires self-abandonment often feels draining. Not because the other person is necessarily harmful, but because the structure of the interaction is not sustainable. It requires one person to carry more than they should, to adjust more than they should, to give more than they should. And over time, this creates depletion. A feeling of being tired without a clear reason, a sense of losing energy in the presence of the other, a quiet wish for space even when you care about them. These are signs, not of failure, but of imbalance. Buddhist teaching encourages balance as a path to peace, not extreme giving, not extreme holding, but a middle way, where both connection and self-respect are present, where care for others does not come at the expense of care for self, where truth is not sacrificed for comfort. This middle way requires awareness of your own experience, to notice when something feels nourishing, when you can relax, when you can speak freely, when you can be present without effort. These are signs of healthy connection, and also to notice when something feels restrictive, when you feel tension, when you feel the need to adjust constantly, when you feel less like yourself. These are signs of self-abandonment. Recognizing these signs is the first step. Responding to them is the next. Response does not always mean immediate action. It may begin with acknowledgement, admitting to yourself that something is not aligned, allowing that awareness to exist without pushing it away. Then, gradually, making changes. Small adjustments that bring you closer to your truth. Speaking a little more honestly. setting a boundary where you previously stayed silent, choosing not to agree when it does not feel right. These actions may feel uncomfortable, but they also restore alignment. They bring you back into connection with yourself. And this internal connection is what allows external connection to become healthier. Because when you are grounded in yourself, you no longer rely on others to define your experience. You bring your experience with you. You contribute to the relationship rather than losing yourself in it. This changes the dynamic. It creates more balance, more clarity, more honesty, and over time, more stability. Not because everything becomes perfect, but because the foundation is real. A foundation built on truth rather than performance. This is what distinguishes connection from self-abandonment. Not the absence of effort, but the presence of alignment. Not the absence of challenge, but the presence of truth. Not the absence of adjustment, but the preservation of self. As this understanding deepens, another realization begins to form. Because even when you start choosing yourself more consistently, there may still be a strong fear that remains. The fear of losing people entirely. And this fear can pull you back into old patterns. Because losing others can sometimes feel like losing everything. And this leads into the next layer of understanding. And this is where everything becomes more intense. Because even after seeing the difference between connection and self-abandonment, even after recognizing the moments where you begin to lose yourself, there is still something powerful that keeps pulling you back. It is not always logic. It is not always habit. It is fear. And not just any fear. The fear of losing someone. There is a quiet panic that rises when you feel someone slipping away. It does not always show on the surface. Sometimes it hides behind calm words, controlled behavior, or silence. But inside, something tightens. Your thoughts begin to move faster. Your attention narrows. Your body becomes alert in a way that feels difficult to explain. A sense of urgency appears. You begin to feel that something must be done. Not because you want to control the situation, but because you want to stop what feels like a loss before it fully happens. And in that moment, your focus shifts. It moves away from yourself and locks onto the other person. What are they feeling? What are they thinking? Why are they distant? What changed? What can I do to fix this? These questions begin to repeat, and as they repeat, something important begins to fade. Your awareness of your own state. You stop asking how you feel. You stop noticing what you need. You stop recognizing what is happening inside you, because all your attention is now directed outward. This is how fear begins to take control, not through force, but through focus. And when fear takes control, your actions begin to change. You become more accommodating, more careful, more willing to let things go, more willing to overlook what once mattered, because in that moment, keeping the person feels more important than keeping your ground. This is where the loss begins, not when they leave, but when you start leaving yourself in order to prevent them from leaving you. It happens quietly. You accept things that do not feel right. You stay silent when something bothers you. You adjust your behavior to avoid pushing them away. You become more agreeable, not because you agree, but because disagreement feels dangerous. And each of these actions feels justified, because they are driven by fear. And fear has a way of making everything seem urgent. Everything feels like it matters more than it actually does. Every small shift in their behavior feels significant. Every sign of distance feels like a warning. And because of this, your response becomes stronger. You give more, you try harder, you invest more energy into maintaining the connection. And yet, despite all this effort, something inside you becomes unsettled. Because even as you try to hold on, you can feel yourself slipping, not away from them, but away from yourself. There is a quiet knowing that something is not right. that the way you are showing up is not aligned with who you are. But the fear is stronger. It tells you that this is necessary, that losing them would be worse, that this is just part of caring deeply. But this is where the deeper truth begins to emerge. The fear of losing someone can lead you to lose something even more important: your sense of self, your dignity, your peace. And this loss is not always obvious at first. It does not happen in a single moment. It happens gradually, through repeated choices that prioritize connection over truth. Each time you ignore your own discomfort, you move a little further away from yourself. Each time you accept something that does not feel right, you create a small fracture. Each time you silence your voice, you weaken your connection to your own experience. And over time, these small shifts create a larger pattern, a pattern where your identity becomes secondary, where your presence becomes conditional, where your sense of worth becomes tied to whether someone stays or leaves. This is the emotional surrender that fear creates, not because you lack strength, but because you are trying to protect something that feels important. But the protection comes at a cost, because the more you try to hold on, the more you rely on the other person for stability. And the more you rely on them, the less stable you feel. This is the paradox. The tighter you hold, the more fragile everything becomes, because your sense of peace is now dependent on something that is not within your control. Buddhist wisdom speaks directly to this pattern. It teaches that clinging creates suffering, not because connection is wrong, but because the attempt to hold on to something that is naturally uncertain creates tension. Life is not fixed. People are not fixed. Feelings are not fixed. Everything changes. And when you try to prevent that change, you create resistance. That resistance is felt as anxiety, as fear, as restlessness, because you are trying to hold something still that cannot be held. And the more you try, the more unstable it feels. This is why clinging does not create security. It creates the illusion of control, and illusions, when challenged, create even more fear. When you cling, you are not just holding on to the person, you are holding on to what they represent. Stability, validation, belonging, worth. And when any of these feel threatened, the fear intensifies. Because it is not just about losing them, it feels like losing everything they give you. This is why the reaction can feel so strong, so immediate, so overwhelming. Because the mind believes that without this connection, something essential will be missing. But Buddhist teaching invites a different perspective. It suggests that what you are seeking through the other person is not something they can fully provide, not permanently, not completely, because anything that comes from outside is subject to change. This does not mean that connection has no value. It means that relying on it for your sense of self creates instability. True stability comes from within, from your ability to remain present with yourself, even when things change, even when people come and go, even when uncertainty appears. This kind of stability does not remove fear completely, but it changes your relationship with it. Instead of reacting immediately, you begin to observe. You notice the fear as it arises. You feel it in your body. You recognize the thoughts that come with it, and instead of acting on them right away, you pause. This pause is important because it creates space. Space between feeling and reaction. Space where awareness can exist. And in that space, something begins to shift. You begin to see that the fear is not the same as reality. It is a response, a reaction based on past experiences, learned patterns, and the mind's attempt to protect you. But protection based on fear often leads to actions that create more suffering. By pausing, you allow yourself to respond differently. You can choose to stay with your own experience, to feel the discomfort without immediately trying to fix it, to remain present even when the situation feels uncertain. This is not easy. It goes against the instinct to act, to control, to secure, but it is also where freedom begins, because when you stop reacting automatically, you regain choice. You can choose to speak honestly, to express your needs, to maintain your boundaries, even when fear is present. This does not guarantee that the other person will stay, but it ensures that you do not lose yourself in the process. And this is the deeper teaching, that keeping yourself is more important than keeping anyone else, not in a selfish way, but in a fundamental way. Because without yourself, there is no stable foundation for anything else. As this understanding grows, something else begins to change. The fear of losing people becomes less overwhelming. Not because loss becomes easy, but because it no longer feels like the end of your sense of self. You begin to see that people can leave without taking your worth with them. That connection can change without destroying your identity. That loss can be experienced without losing yourself. This creates a different kind of strength, one that is not based on control, but on presence. You become less reactive, less dependent, more grounded. You still care, you still feel, you still value connection, but you no longer sacrifice yourself to maintain it. This changes how you move through relationships. You become more honest, more clear, more aligned. You do not avoid difficult conversations. You do not ignore discomfort. You do not suppress your truth to keep things stable. Because you understand that stability built on self-loss is not real stability. It is temporary, and temporary stability always leads to deeper instability. By choosing yourself, you create a different foundation, one that can support connection without being dependent on it, one that allows you to engage fully without losing your center, one that remains even when others do not. This is where peace begins to take root, not as a constant feeling, but as a stable presence, a sense that you are okay even when things are uncertain, that you can handle change, that you can move through loss, that you can remain whole. And as this peace grows, another layer of understanding begins to appear. Because even with this strength, there may still be deeper patterns shaping how you experience love and connection, patterns that began long before these relationships, patterns that make approval feel necessary, not just desirable. And this leads into the next exploration, and this is where the story goes even deeper. Because even after understanding fear, even after seeing how clinging creates suffering, there is still a question that remains underneath everything. Why does it feel so intense? Why does losing someone feel like losing stability itself? Why does approval feel so necessary, not just comforting, but almost essential? This is where the roots begin to show. Something old is still living inside your reactions. There are feelings that seem too strong for the moment you are in. A simple silence from someone can create anxiety. A small shift in tone can feel like rejection. A delay in response can feel like distance. These reactions are not random, they are echoes. Echoes of earlier experiences where connection was not always steady, where care was not always consistent, where love felt present one moment and uncertain the next. The body remembers these patterns, even if the mind does not fully recall them. Childhood is where the first understanding of connection is formed, not through words, but through experience, through how you were responded to, through how your emotions were received, through whether your needs were met, ignored, or dismissed. These early interactions create a foundation, a silent belief system about what love feels like, what connection requires, and what must be done to maintain it. If care was consistent, if presence was stable, if emotions were allowed and understood, the system learns that connection is safe, that it does not need to be earned constantly, that it can be trusted. But if care was unpredictable, if attention came and went, if love felt conditional, something else is learned. That connection is not guaranteed, that it must be protected, that it must be maintained through effort, that being yourself may not be enough, This learning does not stay in childhood. It continues into adulthood. It shapes how you respond to others, how you interpret their behavior, how you experience closeness. If love once felt uncertain, the mind becomes alert. It scans for signs. It looks for changes. It prepares for loss, even when loss has not occurred. This is not weakness. It is adaptation. The system learned that paying attention was necessary, that staying aware could prevent disconnection, that adjusting could maintain closeness, and so it continues. Even when the environment has changed, even when the people are different, the pattern remains. This is why approval can begin to feel like survival, not in a literal sense, but in an emotional sense, because the system associates connection with safety and disconnection with threat. When someone responds warmly, there is a sense of relief, a feeling that everything is okay. When someone becomes distant, there is tension, a feeling that something is wrong. And the response is immediate. The mind begins to act. It tries to restore the connection, to bring things back to stability, to regain the sense of safety. This is where behaviors begin to form. You become more attentive, more responsive, more willing to adjust, more focused on the other person's needs, not because you want to lose yourself, but because you are trying to maintain a sense of emotional security. This is where the line between connection and survival begins to blur, because the need for approval is no longer just about being liked. It becomes about feeling safe, feeling stable, feeling okay. And when something carries that weight, it becomes powerful. It becomes difficult to let go, difficult to question, difficult to change, because changing it feels like risking something essential. Buddhist wisdom approaches this with compassion. It does not judge these patterns. It recognizes that they were formed for a reason, that they were responses to real experiences, that they were attempts to create stability in an environment where stability was not always present. But it also teaches that what was once necessary may no longer be helpful, that patterns formed in one context can create suffering in another. And that awareness is the key to transformation. When you begin to see these patterns, not as fixed parts of who you are, but as learned responses, something begins to shift. You create space. Space between the feeling and the meaning, between the reaction and the response. Instead of immediately acting on the need for approval, you begin to notice it. You feel the urge to be liked, to be accepted, to be reassured. And instead of following it automatically, you pause. This pause is important because it allows you to observe, to see the pattern in action, to recognize that the intensity of the feeling may not be about the present moment alone, that it may be connected to something older, something deeper. This recognition does not remove the feeling, but it changes your relationship with it. You no longer see it as a command. You see it as information. Something that can be understood. Something that can be worked with. Something that does not have to control your behavior. This is where healing begins. Not through forcing yourself to stop needing approval, but through understanding why the need is there. When you understand the origin, you create compassion for yourself, for your reactions, for your sensitivity. This compassion is important, because without it, you may try to reject these parts of yourself, to suppress them, to act as if they do not exist. But suppression does not lead to freedom. It leads to more tension, more resistance, more inner conflict. Instead, Buddhist teaching encourages acceptance. Not acceptance in the sense of resignation, but in the sense of acknowledgement. Recognizing that these patterns are part of your experience, that they developed for a reason, that they are not flaws, but adaptations. And from this place of acceptance, change becomes possible. Because you are no longer fighting yourself. You are working with yourself. As you begin to observe the need for approval, you may notice how often it appears. in conversations, in decisions, in interactions, in silence. It shows up in subtle ways, wanting to be liked, wanting to be understood, wanting to be seen in a certain way. These desires are natural, but when they become tied to your sense of safety, they create pressure. And that pressure leads to behaviors that move you away from yourself. By noticing these moments, you begin to create choice. Instead of automatically adjusting, you can ask yourself questions. What am I feeling right now? What am I afraid of? What do I actually need? Is this response coming from my present experience or from something older? These questions do not need immediate answers. They simply create awareness, and awareness begins to loosen the pattern, because the pattern relies on automatic response, on moving quickly from feeling to action. When you slow that process down, the pattern loses some of its strength. Over time, this creates a new experience, one where connection is still important, but not overwhelming, where approval is still appreciated, but not necessary for stability, where relationships are still valued, but not used as a source of identity. This shift does not happen all at once. It develops gradually, through repeated moments of awareness, through small choices to stay present with yourself, through a willingness to feel discomfort without immediately trying to fix it. And as this develops, something else begins to change. Your sense of safety begins to move inward. Instead of relying on others to feel stable, you begin to experience stability within yourself. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer dependent on external validation to feel okay. This creates a different kind of strength, one that is quiet, not based on control, not based on avoidance, but based on presence. You become less reactive, less driven by fear, more able to engage with others without losing yourself. This does not mean that old patterns disappear completely. They may still appear. Moments of wanting approval, moments of fearing rejection, moments of feeling uncertain. But they no longer define your behavior. They become part of your awareness, not the center of it. This is where freedom begins. Not in the absence of need, but in the ability to experience need without being controlled by it. And as this freedom grows, another layer of understanding begins to form. Because even with awareness of these patterns, there is still a part of the mind that seeks validation, a part that wants to be wanted, a part that looks for confirmation of its existence through others. And this leads into the next exploration. And this is where something even more hidden begins to come into view. Because after tracing the need for approval back to early experiences, after seeing how deeply it can shape the way connection is felt, another layer quietly reveals itself. It is not just about wounds, or fear, or conditioning. There is also something within the mind that is constantly trying to confirm that you matter. Something that wants to feel seen, recognized, desired, and important. And this part does not always speak clearly, but it moves everything. There is a quiet voice that does not want to feel invisible. It does not want to feel ordinary. It does not want to feel forgotten. It wants to feel significant in someone's eyes. It wants to be the one they think about, the one they choose, the one they come back to. And when this does not happen, something inside reacts. Not just with sadness, but with a sense of shrinking, a sense that your presence is not enough on its own. This is where the ego begins to show itself, not as something loud or arrogant, but as something deeply sensitive. The ego is not always about thinking you are better than others. Very often, it is about needing to feel like you exist through the attention of others. It looks for signals. Do they notice me? Do they value me? Do they choose me? Do I matter to them? And when the answer feels like yes, there is relief, a temporary sense of fullness, a feeling that you are real, that you have a place, that you are seen. But when the answer feels like no, or even uncertain, something inside becomes unsettled. because the ego depends on these responses to feel stable. This dependence creates movement, a constant effort to gain, maintain, and protect attention. Sometimes it shows up as trying to impress, sometimes as trying to be liked, sometimes as trying to be needed, sometimes as trying to be irreplaceable. The form changes, but the intention remains the same: to feel real through the eyes of someone else. This is why being wanted can feel so powerful. It is not only about connection, it is about confirmation. Confirmation that you are enough, that you are significant, that you have value. And when that confirmation is present, the ego relaxes, but only temporarily, because it cannot hold on to that feeling permanently. It needs it again, and again, and again. This creates a cycle. You receive attention and you feel stable. The attention fades and you feel uncertain. You seek it again and the cycle continues. This cycle can be subtle. It does not always look like chasing. It can appear as quiet dependency, a need for reassurance, a desire for validation, a sensitivity to how others respond. But underneath, it is the same movement, the search for a sense of self that feels secure. Buddhist teaching approaches the ego differently. It does not treat it as something to destroy, but as something to understand. The ego is a construct, a collection of thoughts, beliefs, and experiences that create a sense of identity. It feels real, it feels solid, but when observed closely, it is always changing. It depends on memory, on interpretation, on external input. It is not fixed. And because it is not fixed, it cannot provide lasting stability. When the ego tries to build its identity through being wanted, it creates a fragile structure. Because being wanted is not constant. People's feelings change, circumstances shift, attention moves, and when that happens, the identity built on that attention begins to feel unstable. This is why the need to be wanted can feel so urgent, because it is tied to your sense of existence. Without it, something feels missing. But this feeling is not coming from reality itself. It is coming from the way the ego has learned to define itself. Buddhist practice invites a different kind of exploration. Instead of asking, "How can I be more wanted?" it asks, "Who am I without needing to be wanted?" This question is not easy, because it removes the usual reference points. It does not rely on how others see you. It does not depend on feedback. It does not look for validation. It turns inward. And at first, this can feel uncomfortable, because without the usual markers of identity, there is a sense of uncertainty. But within that uncertainty, something important begins to emerge, a deeper awareness, one that is not based on roles or approval or attention, one that exists regardless of how others respond. This awareness is quieter. It does not seek recognition. It does not need to be confirmed. It simply is. When you begin to connect with this deeper sense of self, something changes. The need to be wanted does not disappear completely, but it loses its urgency. It becomes a preference, not a requirement. You can still appreciate attention. You can still enjoy being valued, but your sense of existence is no longer tied to it. This creates a different kind of freedom. You no longer shape yourself to be desired. You no longer depend on others to feel real. You no longer measure your worth by how much you are wanted. Instead, you begin to experience yourself directly, through your thoughts, through your feelings, through your presence. This experience is more stable, because it does not depend on external change. It is available at all times. And from this place, relationships begin to shift. You are no longer entering them to confirm your value. You are entering them to share your presence. This changes the dynamic. There is less pressure, less need to perform, less fear of not being enough, because you are no longer trying to prove anything. You are simply being. This does not mean you stop caring about how others see you. It means that their perception is no longer the foundation of your identity. It becomes information, not definition. you can take it into account without being controlled by it. This balance is important because it allows you to remain open without becoming dependent, to engage without losing yourself, to care without needing constant confirmation. As this balance develops, the ego begins to relax, not because it has been removed, but because it is no longer under pressure to maintain a constant sense of worth. It no longer needs to seek validation in the same way. It can exist without constantly proving itself. This creates a different kind of peace, one that is not tied to being seen in a certain way, one that does not fluctuate with attention, one that remains steady even when external conditions change. This peace is not dramatic, it is subtle, but it is stable. And stability is what the ego has been seeking all along, not through being wanted, but through feeling secure. When that security is found within, the need to be wanted changes. It becomes something that can be enjoyed, but not something that defines you. And this changes how you relate to others. You become more genuine, more present, more aligned, because you are no longer trying to become something. You are allowing yourself to be what you already are. This does not mean relationships become perfect. There will still be moments of uncertainty, moments of doubt, moments of desire, but they are no longer overwhelming because they are not tied to your sense of existence. They are part of the experience, not the center of it. This is where deeper connection becomes possible, not through trying to be wanted, but through being real, not through seeking approval, but through sharing presence, not through performing, but through simply being. And as this understanding deepens, another pattern begins to reveal itself. Because even when the need to be wanted softens, there can still be a tendency to give too much, to offer more than is balanced, to sacrifice more than is necessary, not always out of generosity, but sometimes out of something deeper. And this leads into the next exploration. And this is where something that once felt beautiful begins to show its hidden weight. Because even after the need to be wanted begins to loosen, even after the ego is no longer chasing validation in the same way, there can still remain a pattern that feels noble on the surface. Giving, caring, showing up, doing more than what is asked. And at first it feels like love. But there is a quiet question that begins to rise. Is all giving truly kindness? There is a kind of giving that feels heavy even while it looks generous. It does not always show itself clearly. It can look like support, like patience, like sacrifice, like effort. It can look like being the one who always understands, the one who always forgives, the one who always shows up, no matter what. And because of this, it is rarely questioned. People may even praise it. They may say you are kind, selfless, thoughtful, giving. But inside, something feels different. There is a subtle exhaustion, a quiet imbalance, a feeling that something is being taken without being fully seen. This is where giving begins to shift into overgiving, and overgiving is not always rooted in kindness. Sometimes it is rooted in fear. The fear that if you stop giving, something will be lost. The fear that if you set limits, you will be seen differently. The fear that if you ask for balance, the connection may weaken. So you continue. You give more time, more energy, more attention, more understanding, even when it is not being matched, even when it is not being recognized, even when it begins to cost you your own sense of stability. And this is where the pattern becomes clear. Because the giving is no longer just an expression of care. It becomes a strategy, a way to maintain connection, a way to secure presence, a way to avoid loss. This is not always conscious. It can feel automatic, like something you have always done, like something that feels natural. But when you look closely, there is often a quiet expectation underneath it. Not always spoken, but present. If I give enough, they will stay. If I do enough, they will care. If I sacrifice enough, I will be valued. And this expectation creates tension because it turns giving into something conditional, not outwardly, But internally, you begin to track how much you give, how much you receive, what is noticed, what is not. And when the balance feels off, something begins to build. Not always anger, but something quieter, a sense of being overlooked, a feeling of not being fully appreciated, a subtle frustration that grows over time. This is the emotional cost of overgiving, because while it appears selfless, it is often connected to a deeper need, the need to feel secure, the need to feel valued, the need to feel important in someone else's life. And when these needs are not met, the giving begins to feel heavy. It no longer feels free. It feels like effort. It feels like work. Buddhist teaching offers a different understanding of generosity. It does not reject giving, it encourages it. But it also asks a deeper question. What is the state of mind behind the giving? True generosity comes from fullness, from a place where you are not trying to get something in return, where you are not trying to secure connection, where you are not trying to prove your worth. It is an expression, not a transaction. But when giving is driven by fear or insecurity, it becomes something else. It becomes a way to manage anxiety, a way to control the outcome of a relationship, a way to ensure that you are needed. And this creates dependency, not only on the other person, but on the act of giving itself, because it becomes the method through which you feel connected. This is why it can be difficult to stop, even when it feels exhausting, even when it feels unbalanced, even when it feels unrecognized. Because stopping feels like risking something important. It feels like stepping away from the only way you know how to maintain connection. This is where awareness becomes essential. To notice when giving feels light and when it feels heavy. To recognize when it comes from genuine care and when it comes from fear. This distinction is not always obvious because both can look similar from the outside. But the internal experience is different. When giving is healthy, there is ease. You offer what you can without losing yourself. You do not feel drained afterward. You do not feel resentful. You do not feel the need to be acknowledged. You give because it feels right, not because it feels necessary. When giving becomes overgiving, the experience changes. There is tension, a sense of effort, a feeling of giving more than you have, a quiet hope that it will be noticed, and when it is not, a quiet disappointment. This is where the imbalance becomes clear. Because true generosity does not depend on recognition. It does not require return. It does not create expectation. It flows freely. But overgiving often carries a hidden expectation, not because you want to control others, but because you are trying to feel secure. This is where Buddhist wisdom offers a path back to balance, not by stopping giving completely, but by changing the relationship to it, by reconnecting with your own needs, by recognizing that your well-being matters, that your energy is not unlimited, that your presence is not something to be given without awareness. This does not mean becoming closed. It means becoming conscious. Aware of what you are offering, aware of why you are offering it, aware of how it affects you. This awareness allows you to choose, instead of reacting automatically, instead of giving out of habit. You begin to give with intention, and intention changes everything. It brings clarity, it brings balance, it brings alignment. You begin to recognize when something is too much, when a situation is one-sided, when your effort is not being met. And instead of continuing the pattern, you pause, you consider, you adjust, not out of withdrawal, but out of respect for yourself. This respect is important because without it, giving becomes self-neglect. And self-neglect cannot sustain real connection. It creates imbalance, it creates dependency, it creates silent suffering. When you begin to respect your own limits, something shifts. You become more grounded, more aware of your capacity, more in tune with your own experience, and this changes how you show up. You are still kind, still caring, still present, but you are not overextending. You are not losing yourself in the process. This balance allows generosity to become what it is meant to be, a natural expression of care, not a strategy for connection. As this balance develops, relationships begin to change. You are no longer giving to be needed. You are giving because you choose to, and this choice creates freedom. Freedom from expectation, freedom from pressure, freedom from the need to prove your value through effort. This does not mean others will always respond in the way you hope, but it means that your sense of self is no longer tied to that response. You remain stable, regardless of how your giving is received. This stability creates a different kind of connection, one that is based on mutual presence, not on imbalance, not on silent sacrifice, not on unspoken expectations, but on shared understanding, shared respect, shared awareness. And as this understanding deepens, another realization begins to emerge. Because even when overgiving is seen clearly, even when balance begins to return, there is still something that can be overlooked, something that happens quietly within. The way you ignore your own truth in order to maintain peace, and this leads into the next layer of understanding. And this is where the pattern becomes even more quiet, yet more powerful. Because after seeing how overgiving drains you, after recognizing how much energy is lost trying to maintain balance through effort, something deeper begins to surface. It is not only about what you do for others, but what you stop doing for yourself. What you stop saying, what you stop feeling, what you stop acknowledging. And this is where the next truth begins to unfold. Something inside you has been trying to speak for a long time. It does not shout. It does not demand attention. It shows up in small moments, in subtle ways, a hesitation before you agree, a tightness in your chest when something does not feel right, a quiet thought that says, "This is not what I want." But almost immediately something else follows. A second voice, softer but more controlling. It says, "It is not a big deal." It says, "Just let it go." It says, "This is not worth the conflict." It says, "Keep the peace." And without noticing, you listen to the second voice, not because it feels true, but because it feels safer. This is where inner truth begins to be silenced. Not once, but repeatedly. In conversations where you choose comfort over honesty, in decisions where you follow what is expected instead of what is real, in moments where you feel something clearly but convince yourself to ignore it. Each time it seems small, insignificant. But over time, these moments create a pattern of disconnection from yourself. This disconnection is not loud. It does not appear as a clear problem. It feels like something you can manage, something you can live with. But beneath that surface, something else is happening. Every time you ignore what you truly feel, a subtle tension is created. A tension between your inner experience and your outward expression. This tension does not disappear. It accumulates, it builds quietly, and eventually it becomes something you carry with you. Not as a clear thought, but as a feeling. A sense of being slightly off, a sense that something is not aligned. This is the hidden violence. Not violence in the physical sense, but in the way you turn against your own experience, in the way you dismiss your own reality, in the way you prioritize external harmony over internal truth. This kind of violence is difficult to see because it is often justified. You tell yourself that you are being understanding, that you are being patient, that you are being kind, and in many ways you are. But kindness that excludes yourself becomes imbalance. Patience that silences your truth becomes suppression. Understanding that ignores your own needs becomes neglect. This is where the line becomes important. Because not all silence is peaceful. Sometimes silence is avoidance. Sometimes silence is fear. Sometimes silence is the result of believing that your truth is less important than the connection you are trying to protect. This belief is subtle, but it shapes everything. It influences how you speak, how you act, how you respond, how you experience yourself, and over time, it creates a version of you that is less visible, less expressed, less present. This is not because you are losing yourself completely, but because you are choosing not to bring yourself forward again and again. Buddhist teaching speaks of truth as a path to liberation, not truth in the sense of facts or opinions, but truth in the sense of direct experience, what you feel, what you know, what is real for you in this moment. When this truth is ignored, suffering increases, not because the situation itself is unbearable, but because you are creating division within yourself. One part of you feels something clearly, another part denies it, and this division creates conflict, not externally but internally. It is the feeling of being pulled in two directions, of knowing something but not acting on it, of feeling something but not expressing it. This internal conflict can show up in many ways, as anxiety, as restlessness, as difficulty relaxing, as a sense of being unsettled without a clear reason, because something inside you is not being acknowledged. This is why self-honesty becomes essential, not as a dramatic act, but as a consistent practice. To notice what you feel without immediately dismissing it. To recognize what you need without judging it. To acknowledge what is true for you, even if you are not ready to express it outwardly. This honesty is not always comfortable because it removes the layer of avoidance. It brings you face to face with your own experience. And sometimes that experience includes things you would rather not see: discomfort, doubt, fear, uncertainty. But avoiding these does not remove them, it only pushes them deeper. And what is pushed deeper often becomes stronger, more persistent, more difficult to ignore. By allowing yourself to see clearly, you begin to reduce this internal pressure. You give space to what is already there. And in that space, something begins to shift. The tension softens, the conflict lessens, because you are no longer resisting your own experience. This does not mean you act on every feeling. It means you acknowledge it, you respect it, you allow it to exist, and from that place you can respond more clearly, without suppression, without denial, without distortion. This clarity changes how you relate to others. You begin to speak more honestly, not in a harsh or reactive way, but in a grounded way. You express what you feel without needing to justify it excessively. You set boundaries without feeling the need to explain them in detail. You allow your truth to be present in the interaction. This may create discomfort, because not everyone is used to this level of honesty, especially if they are accustomed to a version of you that is more accommodating, more agreeable, more silent. But this discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is real. Real connection can handle truth. It may require adjustment, it may involve tension at times, but it does not require suppression. And when suppression is no longer part of the interaction, something changes. The connection becomes more grounded, more stable, more honest. Not because it is perfect, but because it is not built on denial. This does not guarantee that all relationships will continue. Some may not be able to adapt. Some may rely on the version of you that does not speak. And when that version changes, the dynamic changes as well. This can lead to distance, to misunderstanding, to separation. But even in these moments, something important remains: your connection to yourself. And that connection becomes the foundation for everything else. Because without it, no external connection can feel fully stable. Self-honesty is not about pushing others away. It is about bringing yourself back into alignment, back into presence, back into a state where your inner experience and your outer expression are not in conflict. This alignment creates a different kind of peace, not the peace of avoiding tension, but the peace of being real. This peace is quieter, but it is more stable, because it does not depend on external conditions. It comes from within, from the absence of internal conflict. As this practice continues, something else begins to change. You become more aware of when you are about to ignore your truth. The moment becomes clearer. You can feel the hesitation, the impulse to stay silent, the urge to smooth things over, and instead of acting automatically, you pause, you notice, you choose. Sometimes you may still choose silence, but now it is conscious, not automatic, and that makes a difference, because you are no longer abandoning yourself without awareness. You are making a choice. And with awareness, choice becomes more aligned over time, more consistent, more true. This is the path of liberation that Buddhist teaching points toward, not the removal of all difficulty, but the removal of unnecessary suffering, the suffering that comes from ignoring what is real, from denying your own experience, from creating division within yourself. By practicing self-honesty, you reduce this suffering. You bring your experience into the light. You allow it to be seen. And in being seen, it begins to transform. This transformation is not immediate. It unfolds gradually, through repeated moments of awareness, through consistent alignment, through a willingness to face what is real. And as this unfolds, another realization begins to appear. Because even when you begin to live more honestly, even when you stop silencing your truth, there can still be a lingering pain, a loneliness that comes from something deeper. The experience of being loved, but not for who you truly are. And this leads into the next layer of understanding. And this is where the pain becomes quieter, but deeper. Because after learning to hear your inner truth, after beginning to speak more honestly, something else starts to feel impossible to ignore. It is no longer just about what you say or do, but about how you are being seen, or more precisely, how you are not being seen. A strange kind of loneliness can exist even when someone is close to you. It is not the loneliness of being alone. It is the loneliness of being present, yet unseen in a real way, of being appreciated yet not truly known, of being valued, but only for the version of you that you have learned to present. And this kind of loneliness is confusing, because on the surface, everything looks right. There is affection, there is attention, there is connection. You are not being ignored. You are not being rejected. In many ways, you are being loved. But something inside you does not feel at rest. There is a quiet discomfort, a subtle distance, a sense that the love you are receiving is not reaching the deepest parts of you, because those parts are not fully visible. This is the loneliness of being loved for a version of you that is not real. It begins in small ways. You hold back certain thoughts. You soften certain emotions. You present certain aspects of yourself more clearly than others. Not because you want to deceive, but because you want to be accepted. And when acceptance comes, it feels good. At first, there is relief, a sense that you are valued, that you belong. But over time, something begins to feel off, because the acceptance is tied to what is being shown, not to what is being hidden, and the parts of you that remain unseen begin to feel isolated, not rejected, but untouched, unrecognized, unincluded in the connection. This creates a split. One part of you is engaged in the relationship, the other part is watching from a distance, aware that what is being loved is not the full picture, and this awareness creates tension, because you cannot fully relax into the connection. There is always a layer of performance, even if it is subtle, even if it is unintentional. You are still managing how you are seen, and managing requires effort, constant, quiet effort, to maintain the version of yourself that is being accepted. This effort becomes exhausting over time, not because you are doing something dramatic, but because you are not fully at ease. You are present, but not fully expressed. You are connected, but not fully known. And this creates a deeper form of loneliness than physical isolation, because in isolation, the absence of others is clear. But in this situation, the presence of others makes the absence of true connection more painful. It feels like something is almost there, but not quite. Like being close to something meaningful, but unable to fully reach it. Buddhist teaching speaks of this in a subtle way. It points to the suffering that arises when there is a gap between reality and appearance, when what is presented is not aligned with what is true. This gap creates tension, because it requires constant maintenance, and maintenance prevents stillness. True connection does not require maintenance in the same way. It allows for presence without performance. It allows for expression without filtering. It allows for being seen as you are, not as you appear. But reaching that kind of connection requires something difficult. It requires vulnerability. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, consistent way. The willingness to let yourself be seen, not just in your strengths, but in your uncertainties. Not just in your clarity, but in your confusion. Not just in your calmness, but in your discomfort. This is where fear often returns, because being seen fully means risking rejection. Not rejection of a version, but rejection of the real. And that feels more personal, more exposing, more vulnerable. So the mind resists. It prefers the safety of partial visibility, the comfort of being accepted for something that is controlled. But this safety has a cost, because it limits the depth of connection. It keeps the relationship at a level where true intimacy cannot fully develop. Because intimacy requires truth, not perfection, not constant agreement, not smooth interaction, but truth. And truth cannot exist where parts of you are consistently hidden. This is why the loneliness persists, even when the connection appears strong, because the connection is not reaching the parts of you that need it most. Those parts remain outside of the interaction, waiting, unacknowledged, unexpressed. This waiting creates a quiet sadness, not always obvious, but present. It shows up in moments of reflection, in moments of silence, in moments where you realize that something important has not been shared, something that feels too risky, too uncertain, too difficult to bring forward. And each time you choose not to bring it forward, the distance remains, not between you and the other person, but within yourself. Buddhist wisdom encourages a return to authenticity, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. To reduce the gap between what is felt and what is expressed, to allow more of yourself to be present in each interaction. This does not mean sharing everything at once. It means gradually reducing the need to filter yourself, allowing more honesty, more presence, more alignment. This process can feel uncomfortable because it changes the dynamic. It introduces uncertainty. It removes the layer of control that comes with managing perception. But it also creates possibility. The possibility of being seen, not just in part, but in whole. And when that happens, something shifts. The connection becomes deeper, more grounded, more real, because it is no longer based on appearance. It is based on presence. This presence allows for a different kind of acceptance, one that does not depend on maintaining an image, one that does not require constant adjustment, one that includes all parts of you, not just the ones that are easy to show. This is the freedom that Buddhist teaching points toward, the freedom of being without needing to perform, the freedom of being seen without needing to control how you are seen. The freedom of connection that does not require self-editing. This freedom is not always comfortable, but it is stable, because it is based on truth. And truth does not need to be maintained, it simply is. As you begin to move toward this way of being, something else changes. The loneliness begins to shift. Not because you are no longer alone, but because you are no longer divided within yourself. The parts of you that were hidden begin to be included, in your own awareness first, and then gradually in your interactions. This inclusion creates wholeness, a sense that you are present as a complete person, not a partial version, not an edited version, but as you are. And from this place, connection becomes something different. Not something you maintain, but something you experience. Not something you perform, but something you share. This changes the quality of your relationships, because you are no longer trying to be loved for a version of yourself. You are allowing yourself to be known, and in being known, you create the possibility of being truly loved, not for what you present, but for what you are. And this kind of love feels different. It feels grounding, stable, real, because it does not depend on maintaining a mask. It exists in the absence of one. As this understanding deepens, another pattern begins to reveal itself, because even when you begin to show up more authentically, even when you allow yourself to be seen, there can still be a strong pull to feel needed, to feel useful, to feel important through what you provide. And this leads into the next layer of exploration, and this is where another quiet pattern begins to reveal itself, because even after stepping out of performance, even after allowing yourself to be seen more honestly, there can still be a subtle way the mind tries to secure its place in the world, not by hiding who you are, but by becoming what others rely on. And at first, it feels meaningful. It feels like purpose. It feels like you matter. But beneath that feeling, something deeper begins to move. A strange emptiness can appear the moment no one needs you. Not when people leave, not when they reject you, but when they simply stop depending on you, when they are okay without your help, when they no longer look to you for answers, support, or emotional stability. And in that moment, something inside can feel uncertain. Almost like a question begins to form. If I am not needed, then what am I? This question is not always spoken out loud, but it is felt. It is felt in the silence, in the absence of requests, in the moments where you are not being called upon to fix, to support, to guide, to give. There is a kind of discomfort in simply being, because for a long time, being was not enough. Doing was what created value. Helping was what created connection. Fixing was what created importance. And over time, these actions become identity. You are not just someone who helps, you become the helper. You are not just someone who supports, you become the support. You are not just someone who listens, you become the one who is always there. This identity feels stable. It gives you a place, a role, a sense of belonging. But it also creates dependency, not only from others, but within yourself, because your sense of worth becomes tied to your usefulness. If you are needed, you feel valuable. If you are relied on, you feel important. If you are essential to someone else's well-being, you feel secure. But when that need disappears, even temporarily, something shifts. The sense of value weakens, the sense of importance fades, and the question returns. Who am I without this role? This is where the deeper pattern becomes visible, because the need to be useful is not always about helping others. Sometimes it is about confirming your own existence, about proving that you matter, about feeling real through what you provide. And when that provision is no longer required, the foundation begins to feel unstable. This is not because you lack worth, it is because your worth has been linked to something external, to a role, to a function, to a contribution. Buddhist wisdom offers a different perspective. It teaches that your value is not something that needs to be earned through action. It is not something that increases when you give and decreases when you rest. It is not something that depends on how much you are needed. It exists independently of all of these things. But this understanding is not always easy to accept, because the mind has been trained differently. It has learned to associate value with usefulness, to believe that being important means being necessary, to feel that being loved means being relied upon. These beliefs are often formed early, in environments where attention was given when you helped, when you performed, when you contributed, where being quiet, easy, or supportive created approval. And over time, the mind connects these experiences. It learns that to be valued, you must be useful. This learning becomes automatic. You begin to look for ways to help, to fix, to support, not always because it is needed, but because it feels familiar, because it reinforces your sense of identity. And when others respond positively, the pattern is strengthened. You feel appreciated, recognized, important, and so you continue. But this continuation can lead to imbalance, because your energy becomes directed outward. Your attention becomes focused on others, their needs, their emotions, their problems, and in doing so, something else is neglected. Your own experience, your own needs, your own inner state. This neglect is not intentional, it is a result of focus, of habit, of identity, but over time, it creates a gap between how much you give and how much you receive, not necessarily from others but from yourself. You may be present for everyone else, but absent for yourself. You may be attentive to others, but disconnected from your own feelings. You may be supportive, but not supported. And this creates a quiet imbalance, one that is not always visible, but deeply felt. It can show up as exhaustion, as a sense of being drained without a clear reason, as a feeling of being unfulfilled even when you are doing a lot, because doing is not the same as being. And when your identity is built around doing, being becomes unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, sitting still, not helping, not fixing, not contributing. These moments can feel empty, because they are not aligned with how you have learned to define yourself. This is where the pattern becomes clear. The discomfort is not coming from the absence of action. It is coming from the absence of identity. Without the role of being needed, the mind does not know where to place itself. And this creates uncertainty. But within this uncertainty, there is also an opportunity to explore a different kind of self. One that is not defined by what you do for others, one that exists even when you are not being useful. This exploration begins with awareness, noticing the impulse to step in, to help, to fix, to offer, and asking a simple question: is this coming from care or from a need to feel valuable? This question does not require an immediate answer. It simply creates space. Space to observe your own behavior, to see patterns, to understand motivations. And as this awareness grows, something begins to shift. You start to notice when you are overextending, when you are giving more than is balanced, when you are stepping into roles that are not yours to carry. This noticing allows for choice. Instead of automatically responding, you can pause. You can consider. You can decide whether to engage or not. This does not mean you stop helping. It means you help from a different place, a place that is not driven by the need to feel needed, but by genuine care. Care that does not require self-neglect. Care that does not come at the cost of your own well-being. This shift creates balance. You begin to include yourself in the equation, to recognize that your energy matters, that your presence matters, that your needs matter, and that being is as important as doing. This balance changes your experience. You no longer feel the same urgency to be useful. You can rest without guilt. You can step back without fear. You can allow others to handle their own experiences without feeling responsible for fixing them. This does not reduce your value. It reveals it in a different way, a way that is not dependent on constant action, a way that is stable, consistent, present. Buddhist teaching emphasizes that clinging to identity creates suffering, not because identity is wrong, but because it limits your experience. When you cling to the identity of being the helper, you restrict yourself. You create expectations for yourself, for others, for how situations should unfold, and when those expectations are not met, discomfort arises. By loosening this identity, you create freedom. Freedom to act when it feels right. Freedom to rest when it is needed. freedom to exist without constantly proving your value. This freedom allows you to experience yourself more fully, not just as someone who does, but as someone who is. This being is not passive. It is aware, present, grounded. It allows you to engage with others without losing yourself in the process. It allows you to contribute without overextending. It allows you to care without becoming responsible for everything. And from this place, relationships begin to change. They become more balanced, more mutual, more sustainable, because they are not built on one person carrying more than they should. They are built on shared presence, shared responsibility, shared awareness. This creates a different kind of connection, one that does not depend on constant giving, but on mutual understanding, mutual respect, mutual being. And as this understanding deepens, another realization begins to emerge. Because even when you begin to separate your worth from usefulness, there can still be a tendency to chase something else, something more subtle, the need for reassurance, the need for affection, the need for validation in ways that feel basic yet essential. And this leads into the next layer of exploration, and this is where the pattern becomes even more revealing, because after loosening the need to be useful, after stepping out of the role of always being the one who gives, something else begins to surface. It is quieter, but it carries a deep weight. The need to be reassured, the need to feel chosen again and again, the need to hear, to see, to be reminded that you matter. And when that need is not met naturally, something begins to happen. You start reaching for it. A quiet heaviness appears when something simple is missing. Not something grand, not something complicated, but something basic. A message that feels warm. A response that feels present. A tone that feels caring. A kind of attention that says, without words, you matter here. When these things are given freely, they feel light. They feel natural. They do not need to be questioned. But when they are inconsistent, something changes. You begin to notice the absence. You begin to feel the gap. And slowly, you start trying to fill it. Not always directly. Sometimes it is subtle. You ask questions in a certain way. You hint at what you need. You create opportunities for the other person to respond. You try to guide the interaction toward reassurance. And when it comes, there is relief, a brief moment where everything feels okay again. But when it does not come, the feeling deepens. Not just disappointment, but something more personal. A sense that something is missing where it should naturally exist. This is where the emotional cost begins. Because the more you reach for something that is not freely given, the more your energy becomes tied to its absence. You begin to invest your attention in what is not happening. You begin to focus on what you are not receiving. You begin to measure the connection by what is lacking. And this measurement creates pressure, not only on the other person, but on yourself. Because now you are not just experiencing the relationship, you are monitoring it, watching for signs, tracking responses, analyzing patterns, trying to understand why something simple feels difficult to receive. This effort becomes draining. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are trying to create something that should not require force. Affection, reassurance, respect. These are not things that need to be extracted. They are things that flow naturally when the connection is aligned. When they do not flow, something is being revealed. But instead of seeing that clearly, the mind often turns inward. It asks, what am I doing wrong? What can I change? How can I make this easier for them? And this is where the pattern becomes painful, because instead of recognizing that something is not being given, you begin to adjust yourself to receive it. You become more patient, more understanding, more accommodating, more willing to accept less, not because it feels right, but because it feels necessary. And this necessity creates imbalance, because what should be mutual becomes one-sided. What should be natural becomes effortful. What should be freely given becomes something you have to reach for. This reaching is what creates exhaustion, because it is not just about the action, it is about the emotional weight behind it, the hope, the uncertainty, the waiting, the repeated attempt to receive something that does not come easily. Over time, this affects how you feel about yourself, not immediately, but gradually. Each time you have to ask for basic care, something inside you begins to question its place. Each time you have to explain your needs, something inside you begins to feel less certain. Each time you have to wait for what should be present, something inside you begins to feel less valued. This is not because you are actually less worthy. It is because the experience is shaping your perception. Buddhist wisdom invites a different way of seeing. Instead of focusing only on what is missing, it encourages you to look at the pattern itself, to notice how much energy is being spent trying to receive something that is not being offered freely, to recognize the effort, the repetition, the imbalance, and to ask a deeper question: why am I trying so hard for something that should not require this much effort? This question is not meant to create blame. It is meant to create clarity, because clarity reveals what is actually happening, not what you hope is happening, not what you wish could happen, but what is present in reality. And when you see clearly, something begins to shift. You realize that love does not need to be chased in this way, that care does not need to be requested repeatedly, that respect does not need to be negotiated. These things, when they are real, appear naturally. They may not always be perfect. They may not always be expressed in the same way, but they are present, consistently, without constant effort. When they are not present, the absence is information, not a challenge to overcome, not a problem to fix, but a reality to acknowledge. This acknowledgement can be difficult because it means letting go of the hope that things will change through effort alone. It means accepting that what you are receiving may be what is available, and that this availability does not match what you need. This realization can feel like loss, not of the person, but of the expectation that if you try enough, care will appear. But letting go of this expectation is also what creates space. Space for something different. Space for something more aligned. And this is where self-worth begins to rise. Not through receiving more from others, but through changing your relationship with what you accept. When you stop reaching for what is not freely given, you stop placing yourself in a position of waiting for attention, waiting for reassurance, waiting for validation. Instead, you begin to stand in your own presence. You recognize what you need, you acknowledge what is not being met, and instead of adjusting yourself to fit the situation, you allow the situation to be seen for what it is. This does not always lead to immediate change, but it creates a shift in your position. You are no longer asking, you are observing. You are no longer chasing, you are noticing. And this noticing brings clarity. Clarity about what is being offered, clarity about what is not, clarity about what aligns with your sense of self and what does not. From this place, your choices begin to change, not from a place of reaction, but from a place of understanding. You begin to move toward what feels mutual, what feels natural, what does not require constant effort to maintain. This movement may be slow, it may involve uncertainty, but it is grounded because it is based on reality, not on hope alone. Buddhist teaching emphasizes non-attachment, not as a rejection of connection, but as a way to engage without losing yourself. When you are attached to receiving something specific from someone, you become dependent on their behavior. Your emotional state becomes tied to their actions. This creates instability, because their actions are not within your control. By releasing this attachment, you create space. Space to experience the connection as it is, without trying to shape it constantly. This does not mean you accept everything. It means you see everything clearly. And from clarity, you can choose. You can choose what to engage with, what to step back from, what to continue, what to release. This choice is where self-worth becomes active, not as a belief, but as a practice of recognizing what you deserve, not in a demanding way, but in a grounded way, a practice of not settling for less than what aligns with your sense of self. This does not guarantee that you will always receive what you need, but it ensures that you are not diminishing yourself in the process. And this changes how you feel. Not immediately, but gradually. The exhaustion begins to lift. The constant monitoring begins to soften. The need to chase begins to fade, because you are no longer investing your energy in what is not being given. You are allowing your energy to remain with you. This creates a different kind of stability, one that does not depend on external response, one that is not shaken by inconsistency, one that remains present regardless of what is happening outside. And from this stability, something new becomes possible, a different kind of connection, one that does not require effort to feel basic care, one that does not require repeated requests for presence, one that feels mutual, balanced, natural. This is the kind of connection that does not drain. It supports, it nourishes, it allows you to remain yourself. And as you begin to recognize this difference, another pattern begins to reveal itself. Because even when you stop begging for what should be freely given, there can still be moments where desire distorts how you see things. Moments where longing makes it difficult to recognize what is actually present. And this leads into the next layer of understanding. And this is where the mind becomes hardest to trust. Because even after stepping back from chasing, even after learning to stop begging for what should be freely given, there is still something that can quietly pull you out of clarity again. Desire. Not just any desire, but the kind that feels like it knows exactly what it wants. The kind that feels certain. The kind that feels convincing. And this is where things begin to blur. Something inside you can want something so deeply that it begins to change what you see, not completely, but just enough to keep you attached. A small shift in perception can change everything. What once felt like a clear boundary becomes something you question. What once felt like a warning becomes something you explain away. What once felt like discomfort becomes something you try to understand instead of something you trust. This shift does not happen suddenly. It happens slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. You start noticing certain behaviors, but you soften them in your mind. You see inconsistency, but you label it as complexity. You feel confusion, but you call it depth. You experience distance, but you tell yourself it is temporary. And in doing so, you begin to move away from what is actually happening. This is the distortion that desire creates. It does not lie directly. It rearranges, it filters, it highlights certain parts while minimizing others. It creates a version of reality that supports the feeling you want to hold on to. This is why it feels so convincing. Because it is not entirely false, it is partially true. And that partial truth is enough to keep you engaged. Buddhist teaching describes this as a form of attachment that clouds perception. Not because the mind is weak, but because it is invested. When you want something deeply, the mind begins to protect that desire. It avoids information that threatens it. It focuses on what supports it. And over time, this creates a narrow view, a view that is shaped more by longing than by clarity. This is why red flags can be ignored, not because they are invisible, but because they are inconvenient. They challenge the image you have built. They introduce doubt, and doubt feels uncomfortable. So the mind tries to resolve it. It explains, it justifies, it reframes. You tell yourself they are just going through something. You believe their inconsistency is a sign of depth. You interpret their distance as complexity rather than lack of availability. These interpretations feel reasonable. They allow you to maintain the connection. They reduce immediate discomfort, but they also move you further away from truth. Because truth is not always aligned with desire. And when desire is strong, truth can feel like an obstacle. This is where the pattern becomes difficult to break. Because you are not just dealing with behavior, you are dealing with perception, and perception shapes everything. If you see inconsistency as depth, you will stay. If you see distance as mystery, you will remain curious. If you see neglect as complexity, you will try to understand. These interpretations keep you engaged, even when the experience itself is not aligned with what you need. This creates confusion, because the reality you are experiencing does not match the meaning you are giving it. And this mismatch creates tension, a quiet sense that something is not right. But instead of trusting that feeling, you question it. You think you are overreacting. You think you are misunderstanding. You think you need to be more patient, and so you continue. This continuation strengthens the pattern, because each time you override your perception, you weaken your trust in it. And without trust in your perception, clarity becomes difficult. Buddhist wisdom emphasizes the importance of right seeing things as they are, not as you wish them to be, not as you fear they are, but as they are. This kind of seeing requires awareness, not just of the situation, but of your own mind. To notice when desire is influencing how you interpret things. To recognize when you are focusing only on what supports your attachment. To observe when you are minimizing what feels uncomfortable. This awareness does not remove desire, but it creates space around it. Space where you can question it, where you can examine it, where you can see its influence. And in that space, something begins to shift. You start to see patterns more clearly. You notice repeated behavior. You recognize inconsistency without needing to explain it away. You feel discomfort and allow it to exist without immediately resolving it. This does not make the situation easier, but it makes it clearer. And clarity is what allows for wise action. Without clarity, actions are reactive, driven by desire, driven by fear, driven by hope. With clarity, actions become intentional, grounded, aligned with reality. This is where mindfulness becomes essential, not as a technique, but as a way of being. To remain present with what is happening. To observe without immediately interpreting. To feel without immediately reacting. This presence allows you to experience the situation directly, without the filter of expectation, without the distortion of desire. And when you experience something directly, the truth becomes more visible, not through analysis, but through awareness. You begin to see what is consistent, what is not, what is present, what is missing. This seeing is not always comfortable because it may reveal things you would rather not accept. It may show that the connection is not as stable as you hoped, that the care is not as mutual as you believed, that the depth you felt may have been one-sided. These realizations can feel painful, but they are also freeing because they remove illusion. And without illusion, you can respond to reality, not to an idea, not to a possibility, but to what is actually there. This response may involve difficult choices, stepping back, letting go, re-evaluating. But these choices are grounded. They are not based on fear or longing. They are based on understanding. This is the difference that mindfulness creates. It does not eliminate desire. It allows you to see it clearly, to recognize its influence, to prevent it from controlling your perception. As this practice develops, something else begins to change. You become less reactive to emotional intensity. You no longer interpret strong feelings as proof of depth. You recognize that intensity can come from many places, from uncertainty, from inconsistency, from unpredictability. And that true depth is not measured by how strong something feels, but by how stable it is. This changes how you evaluate connection. You begin to look for consistency, for presence, for clarity, not just for excitement, not just for emotional highs. This shift creates a different experience, one that is less dramatic but more grounded, less confusing but more real. And in this experience, you begin to trust yourself more. Your perception becomes clearer. Your responses become more aligned. Your choices become more intentional. This trust is important because it restores your connection to your own awareness. It allows you to navigate relationships without losing yourself in them. It allows you to engage without being controlled by desire. This does not mean you stop feeling deeply. It means your feelings are no longer distorting your perception. They become part of your experience, not the lens through which everything is seen. This creates balance between emotion and awareness, between desire and clarity, between connection and self. And from this balance, something new becomes possible. A different kind of relationship with love. One that is not based on chasing, not based on illusion, but based on truth. This truth is not always easy, but it is stable. And stability is what allows connection to grow in a healthy way. As this understanding deepens, another insight begins to emerge. Because even with clear seeing, even with awareness of desire, there can still be a tendency to seek approval, to want to be seen in a certain way, to feel validated by how others perceive you. And this leads into the next layer of exploration. What happens when the mind becomes attached to approval itself, and how can it be freed from that need? You started this journey thinking love was something you had to earn, prove, or hold on to at any cost. But now, something is clearer. The moment you begin to lose yourself to be loved, the love stops being real. You've seen how the hunger to be chosen can turn into self-betrayal, how attachment can disguise itself as love, how pleasing others can slowly erase your identity. You've felt how rejection can shake your sense of worth, how fear can make you surrender your peace, and how old wounds can make approval feel like survival. You've uncovered the truth that the ego chases validation to feel real, that overgiving can come from insecurity, that ignoring your inner voice creates silent suffering. You've seen the loneliness of being loved for a version of yourself that isn't true, the emptiness of being valued only when you are needed, and the exhaustion of asking for what love should freely give. And now you understand something deeper. Real love does not ask you to shrink. Real love does not confuse you. Real love does not make you question your worth. The moment you stop chasing, stop performing, stop abandoning yourself, something shifts. You return to your voice, to your truth, to a quiet kind of self-worth that does not need to be proven. And from that place, everything changes. If something in this message spoke to you, don't keep it inside. Drop a comment below and write, "I choose myself." Not for anyone else, but as a reminder to the part of you that has been waiting to come back home. And if you're ready to keep growing, to keep seeing clearly, to keep building a life where you never have to trade yourself for love again, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. Because this is not just content, this is your return.